The barn was already burning when Eliza saw him move. Thomas Avery, the mail-order husband too terrified to speak 3 full sentences since arriving in Colorado, was running straight into the inferno. No warning, no hesitation, just those silent, haunted eyes she'd spent 2 weeks trying to understand, now filled with something that looked like fury or devotion. She'd been ready to send him back east, convinced their arrangement was a mistake. But a man doesn't charge into fire for a woman he doesn't love. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the Colorado afternoon like a blade through silk, long and mournful, echoing off the mountains that stood sentinel over Willow Creek. Eliza Monroe felt the sound in her chest, a vibration that matched the anxious rhythm of her heart as she stood on the weathered platform, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Purple lupines and Indian paintbrush, their colors already wilting in the September heat. Her hands were shaking. She told herself it was the wind, though the air hung still and heavy, thick with the smell of creosote and coal smoke. Around her, the platform bustled with the usual chaos, drummers with their sample cases, a family with squalling children, ranch hands meeting supply shipments. But Eliza felt isolated in the crowd, separated by the magnitude of what she was about to do. She was meeting a husband, a stranger, a man whose name she knew only from 3 carefully written letters and a photograph so faded she could barely make out his features. The locomotive hissed to a stop, metal shrieking against metal, steam billowing up in white clouds that momentarily obscured everything. When it cleared, passengers began descending, first the wealthy ones from the Pullman cars, then the working folks from the day coaches, and finally the travelers from the emigrant cars at the rear. Eliza searched each face, her stomach knotting tighter with every passing second. Expecting someone, Miss Monroe? She turned to find Station Master Doherty watching her with poorly concealed curiosity. The whole town knew what she was doing, had known since she'd mailed that advertisement to the matrimonial agency in Chicago 3 months ago. Respectable woman, 26, ranch owner, seeks honest husband for partnership in life and land. She'd agonized over every word, had crumpled up a dozen drafts before finally sending one. Yes, she said, lifting her chin. My fiancé. The word felt foreign on her tongue, presumptuous. They weren't engaged, not really. They'd exchanged letters and a contract. Thomas Avery of Ohio had agreed to travel west to marry her and help run her failing ranch. In exchange, he'd have a home, a partnership, and whatever affection might grow between them, if any grew at all. Well, I hope he's stronger than he looks, Dougherty said, nodding toward the emigrant car. Eliza's gaze followed his gesture, and her breath caught. A man had just stepped down from the rear platform, moving with the careful deliberation of someone trying not to draw attention. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from the photograph, with broad shoulders that filled his worn jacket. Dark hair needed cutting, fell across his forehead in a way that might have been handsome if he'd lifted his head enough for anyone to see his face properly. But he didn't lift his head. He stood on the platform with his battered carpetbag at his feet, hat clutched in both hands, eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Even from 20 feet away, Eliza could see the rigid tension in his posture, the way his knuckles had gone white around the brim of his hat. "Thomas Avery?" she called, taking a tentative step forward. The man's head jerked up fractionally, enough for her to glimpse his face. He was younger than she'd thought, perhaps 30, with strong features that would have been handsome if not twisted with such obvious anxiety. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, dark blue, she noticed, surprisingly intense, before skittering away like spooked horses. "Ma'am," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Eliza waited for more. Surely there would be more. Some greeting, some acknowledgement of the enormity of this moment. They were meeting for the first time. In less than a week they were supposed to be married, but Thomas said nothing else. He just stood there, staring at the platform boards, his chest rising and falling with breaths that seemed to take effort. Behind her, Dougherty chuckled. "That one looks scared of his own shadow, Miss Monroe. You sure you want to hitch yourself to that?" Heat flooded Eliza's face, part embarrassment, part protective anger she didn't quite understand. She'd only just met this man. She had no reason to defend him. But something in Doherty's casual cruelty sparked an old, familiar fury. She'd spent the last year listening to the town's men tell her she couldn't run her father's ranch alone, that she needed to sell out or marry quickly before she lost everything. Now here was the husband she'd found on her own terms, and they were already mocking him. "Mr. Avery," she said, pitching her voice louder, more formally. "Welcome to Willow Creek. I'm Eliza Monroe." She extended her hand, still clutching the wilting flowers in the other. Thomas stared at her outstretched hand as if it were a snake. For a long, horrible moment, she thought he might not take it. Then slowly he shifted his hat to one hand and reached out with the other. His palm was warm, calloused, surprisingly gentle. The handshake lasted barely a second before he pulled away, but Eliza felt the tremor in his fingers. He's terrified, she realized. Not just nervous, genuinely, bone-deep terrified. I'm... Thomas's voice emerged rough, catching on the words. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he managed, "Pleased to meet you." The words came out too loud, too abrupt, as if he'd had to force them through some physical barrier. His face flushed dark red, and he immediately looked away again. An awful understanding began to dawn on Eliza. "Do you have other luggage?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. Thomas shook his head, gesturing to the single carpet bag. "All right then. My wagon's just over here." She turned and started walking, not looking back to see if he followed. Behind her, she heard the soft scuff of his boots on the platform, keeping a careful distance. The wagon was where she'd left it, her mare Bess standing patient in the traces. Eliza climbed up to the seat and gathered the reins, finally glancing back to find Thomas standing beside the wagon bed, still holding his bag. "You can put your things in the back," she said. "Then come up here. It's an hour's ride to the ranch." He nodded and lifted his bag over the side with surprising ease, the movement revealing the strength in his arms. Then he climbed up beside her, settling onto the bench as far from her as possible, his body angled slightly away as if to make himself smaller. Eliza clicked to Bess, and the wagon rolled forward. The silence that followed was oppressive. Eliza had imagined this ride 100 different ways: polite conversation about his journey, questions about Ohio, perhaps some discussion of the ranch and what work needed doing. She'd even worried he might be one of those men who talked too much, who'd fill every moment with boasting or complaints. She hadn't imagined this crushing quiet. They left the town behind, following the dirt road that wound through the valley. Mountains rose on either side, their peaks already dusted with early snow that glowed pink in the afternoon light. It was beautiful country, the kind of vista that usually inspired comment from newcomers. Thomas said nothing. Eliza glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He sat rigid, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on some point in the distance. She watched his throat work as if swallowing words, saw his lips part once or twice as if to speak before pressing together again. "The ranch is about 40 miles from town," she said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "We don't make the trip often, maybe once a month for supplies. The land's good, though. Good water, good grazing. My father built it up from nothing." She paused, giving him space to respond. Yes, Thomas managed. Then, after visible effort, "It's beautiful country." The words came out stilted, each one seeming to cost him something. Eliza found herself wondering if he was simple-minded, then immediately felt guilty for the thought. The letters he'd sent had been articulate, even eloquent in places. He'd written about his work as a farrier, his knowledge of horses and metalwork, his dreams of having land of his own. The man who'd written those letters was intelligent, thoughtful. This man beside her seemed locked inside himself, unable or unwilling to let those words out. "You wrote that you know horses," she said, trying again. "That's good. We've got about 30 head now, down from 50 last year. Some we sold, some we lost to disease. And the barn needs work. The roof's got holes and the stalls need shoring up. I can do that." Thomas's hands tightened in his lap. "Fix things. I'm good at fixing things. That's what I'm counting on." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, edged with frustration she couldn't quite hide. Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him, and Eliza immediately regretted her tone. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I don't mean to be short with you. It's been a difficult year." Thomas nodded, still not looking at her. After a moment, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hand shook slightly as he held it out to her. "What's this?" He gestured for her to take it, so she did, managing the reins with one hand while unfolding the paper with the other. It was a letter, one of hers, she realized. The first one she'd sent in response to his inquiry through the matrimonial agency. "I know it's your letter," she said, confused. "Why are you showing it to me?" Thomas pointed to a specific line. She followed his finger and read her own words. "I seek a partner who is honest, hardworking, and kind. I do not need poetry or pretty speeches. I need someone who will work beside me and deal fairly." "Oh," Eliza said softly. He took the letter back, folding it carefully and returning it to his pocket. The motion of someone handling something precious. Then, with what seemed like enormous effort, he looked at her directly for the first time since the station. Those blue eyes held something she hadn't expected, a fierce, almost desperate sincerity. "I am," he said, each word deliberate. "Honest, hardworking, kind. I promise you that." Then the eye contact became too much, and he looked away again, his jaw clenched tight. Eliza felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but perhaps the absence of despair. This strange, silent man had carried her letter across half the country, had memorized her words, had used them as evidence of himself when his own voice failed him. "All right," she said. "That's a start." They rode on through the lengthening afternoon, the silence still heavy, but perhaps slightly less oppressive. Eliza used the time to study her new husband-to-be in quick, sidelong glances. He was handsome, she admitted, in a rough, carved way. Strong features, a jaw that looked like it could take a punch, dark stubble that suggested he hadn't shaved that morning. His clothes were worn but clean, carefully mended. The work of his own hands, she suspected. No wife or mother had done that stitching. The collar of his shirt had been turned and re-sewn, extending its life. His boots were old but well-oiled, the leather cracked but not failing. A man who took care of his things. That was something. But it was his eyes that stayed with her, those brief glimpses before he looked away. They didn't match the rest of him, didn't match the hunched shoulders or the strangled words. His eyes were intelligent, observant, and surprisingly warm. Kind eyes, she thought. Sad eyes, maybe, but kind. The sun was lowering toward the mountains when they finally turned onto the private road that led to her ranch. Eliza felt the familiar mix of pride and anxiety that always accompanied this moment. Pride in what her father had built. Anxiety over how much she'd let it decline in the years since his death. The ranch house came into view first, a sturdy two-story structure of weathered pine with a broad front porch. It needed paint, Eliza noted with the same guilt she always felt. The shutters hung slightly crooked and several porch boards had gone soft. Beyond the house stood the barn, a larger building that dominated the yard. Even from a distance, Eliza could see the patches in its roof where she'd tried and failed to properly repair the damage from last winter's storms. The chicken coop listed to one side, and the fence around the horse pasture had rails missing in several places. It was a working ranch gone to seed, held together by determination and little else. She felt Thomas's attention sharpen, taking it all in. She couldn't read his expression, but she imagined his thoughts. This is what I've signed up for. This mess, this failure. It's worse than it probably sounded in the letters, she said, unable to keep the defensiveness from her voice. But the land is good. The water's reliable. With proper work, it could be profitable again. It's not bad, Thomas said quietly. Eliza turned to stare at him. What? I said, it's not bad. He was looking at the ranch with an expression she couldn't quite name. I've seen worse. Much worse. This has good bones. Just needs... He trailed off, but his hands moved slightly, as if tracing repairs only he could see. Something in Eliza's chest loosened slightly. She pulled the wagon up in front of the house and set the brake. Before she could climb down, Thomas had already jumped from his seat and hurried around to her side, offering his hand to help her descend. The gesture surprised her. Old-fashioned courtesy she hadn't expected from someone who seemed to want to disappear into himself. She took his hand, feeling again that warmth, that gentleness. Thank you, she said. He nodded and immediately stepped back, retrieving his bag from the wagon bed. "I'll show you the house," Eliza said. "You'll have your own room upstairs, the north bedroom. We'll maintain separate quarters until—" She felt her face heat. "Until after the wedding. If we still want to proceed with the wedding." Thomas's expression flickered with something that might have been hurt, but he nodded. Eliza led him inside, acutely aware of how the house must look to fresh eyes. She'd tried to keep it clean, but one woman alone couldn't maintain everything. Dust gathered in corners, and the curtains needed washing. The furniture was good, her mother's things well made and solid, but the house had the empty feeling of a place where someone had died, as if her father's absence had left a vacuum that all her activity couldn't fill. "Kitchen's through here," she said, gesturing. "Parlor's on the right. My room is downstairs off the kitchen. Yours is up those stairs, first door on the left." Thomas climbed the stairs with his bag, his footsteps careful and quiet. Eliza heard him cross the floor above, heard the creak of the bed as he presumably set his bag down. Then silence. She stood in the hallway, suddenly uncertain. Should she follow him up? Give him time alone? What was the protocol for hosting a mail-order husband you'd just met? After a few minutes, Thomas came back down the stairs, moving with that same careful deliberation. He'd removed his jacket, revealing a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. His forearms were corded with muscle, marked with small scars, the evidence of years working with metal and horses. "I should—" He gestured vaguely toward the door. "The horses. Need water?" "They're in the near pasture," Eliza said. "There's a creek that runs through it, so they have water. But if you want to check on them, introduce yourself. That would be good." Thomas nodded and headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, before he finally spoke. "Thank you," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. For giving me a chance. Despite—" He made a frustrated gesture at himself, at his inability to speak properly. "Despite this." Then he was gone, out into the yard before Eliza could respond. She watched through the window as he walked toward the pasture with long strides, his body seeming to relax slightly with every step away from the house, away from her. This is going to be harder than I thought, Eliza realized. She'd expected challenges, of course. Merging two lives was never simple, but she'd imagined those challenges would be about compatibility, about learning each other's habits and quirks. She'd imagined conversations, negotiations, the slow building of understanding. She hadn't imagined this wall of silence, this man who could barely force words past his lips. How were they supposed to build a partnership, a marriage, if they couldn't even talk to each other? Eliza moved to the kitchen, needing to keep her hands busy. She'd prepared a roast that morning, left it cooking slowly all day. Now she checked it, added vegetables, tried not to think about the awkward dinner that lay ahead. Through the window, she could see Thomas in the pasture. He'd climbed up to sit on the fence rail, and the horses had gathered around him, curious, friendly. He held out his hand to her bay gelding, Copper, letting the horse sniff him. Then he was stroking Copper's nose, his whole body language changing. His shoulders dropped, his posture eased. She could see his mouth moving. He was talking to the horse. Actually talking, with what looked like complete sentences and no visible struggle. Eliza felt a spike of something that might have been jealousy, or frustration, or maybe just profound confusion. He could talk to horses, but not to her? She watched as more horses approached him. He greeted each one, his hands gentle, his manner calm and assured. This was a different Thomas Avery, confident, competent, at ease. The horses sensed it too. Even Daisy, the skittish mare who'd been abused by her previous owner, edged closer to investigate this stranger. Within 15 minutes, Thomas had every horse in the pasture clustered around him like old friends. Well, Eliza thought, at least he wasn't lying about knowing horses. The sun was setting by the time she called him for dinner. She stepped onto the porch and waved, seeing him notice immediately. He climbed down from the fence, said something to the horses, an actual farewell, and started back toward the house. The moment he reached the yard, she saw the change. His shoulders hunched again, his steps became more hesitant. By the time he climbed the porch steps, he was back to that careful, fearful version of himself. It was like watching someone put on armor, or maybe take it off. Eliza wasn't sure which. "Dinner's ready," she said. Thank you, ma'am. You can call me Eliza. Eliza, he repeated, as if testing the name. Then, with visible effort, thank you, Eliza. They ate in the kitchen at the small table, more intimate than the formal dining room, which Eliza had stopped using after her father's death. She'd set 2 places across from each other, had put out her mother's good plates in an attempt to make the occasion special. But special was hard to achieve in the midst of such profound silence. Thomas ate mechanically, eyes on his plate. He had good table manners, she noted. He used his knife and fork properly, didn't talk with his mouth full, not that he talked at all, and chewed with his mouth closed. Someone had taught him well. The horses seem to like you, Eliza ventured. Thomas looked up, surprised, then nodded. They're good horses, well treated. The bay has some heat in his front right. Might want to check that. I noticed that yesterday, Eliza said. I wasn't sure if it was serious. Probably not. Just keep an eye on it. Silence fell again. Silence fell. Eliza searched for something else to say, some way to bridge this gulf between them. Your letters mentioned you worked as a farrier in Ohio, she said. Did you like the work? Thomas's jaw tightened. She could see him struggling, could practically feel the effort it cost him to respond. Yes, he finally managed. Then, after a long pause, good work, honest work, but not mine. Worked for someone else. He made a frustrated gesture. Wanted your own place, Eliza finished for him. He nodded gratefully, relief evident in his eyes. That's why I answered your advertisement, she said. Not just because I need help, though I do, but because I thought maybe we'd want the same things. Partnership, independence, a chance to build something that's ours. Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes. And something else, something that looked like hope. Yes, he said simply. They finished the meal in silence, but it felt slightly less oppressive. After dinner, Thomas insisted on helping with the dishes despite Eliza's protests. They worked side by side at the pump, Eliza washing, Thomas drying, and the simple domesticity of it felt both strange and oddly natural. When the last plate was put away, they stood awkwardly in the kitchen. Full dark had fallen outside, and the house felt very quiet, very isolated. Thomas gestured toward the stairs. Yes, of course, you must be exhausted from your journey. He nodded but didn't move immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. He held it out to her. What's this? Eliza took it, confused. Thomas pointed to the book, then to himself, then made a writing motion with his hand. Then he was gone, climbing the stairs 2 at a time as if fleeing. Eliza looked down at the book in her hands. It was a journal, worn soft with use. She opened it carefully and found page after page of careful handwriting. Thomas's handwriting, she realized, recognizing it from his letters. The entries weren't dated diary entries. They were thoughts, observations, things he wanted to say but couldn't. She flipped through, catching fragments. Watched the sunrise today. Made me think about new beginnings. Hoping I'm not a fool for taking this chance. And later, her letter arrived. She sounds lonely. I understand lonely. The most recent entry from the train made her chest tight. Almost there. Terrified she'll take one look at me and send me back. Terrified I won't be enough. But I have to try. Can't spend my whole life being afraid. Eliza closed the book gently, her throat aching. He'd given her this, given her access to his thoughts when his voice failed him. It was a gift, she realized, a key to understanding him. She looked up at the ceiling, hearing the faint creak of floorboards as Thomas moved around in his room. A stranger, and yet somehow not. She'd invited him into her home, her life, had promised to consider marrying him. And he was trying. In his own way, with the tools he had, he was trying. That has to count for something, Eliza thought. She took the journal to her room and placed it carefully on her nightstand. Then she changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, and went through the motions of preparing for bed, while her mind spun with questions and uncertainties. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance. The sound was lonely, plaintive. Eliza lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. Upstairs, Thomas lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling of his new room. The bed was comfortable, more comfortable than any he'd slept in for years. The room was clean, the house was solid, and the woman downstairs was far kinder than he'd had any right to expect. But he'd seen the frustration in her eyes, heard the impatience in her voice. She'd expected someone different, someone who could talk to her, converse properly, be a real partner in all the ways that mattered. Instead, she'd gotten him. Thomas Avery, the man who'd been mocked and dismissed his whole life for the way words tangled in his mouth and refused to come out right. He'd hoped coming west would be different, hoped that in a new place with a new start, maybe he could be different. But he was still himself, still broken in the same old ways. Thomas pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, fighting the familiar wave of self-loathing. He'd traveled 1,000 miles to escape himself, only to discover he'd brought himself along. The woman downstairs, Eliza, deserved better. She was beautiful, strong, intelligent. She'd built him up in his mind during their correspondence into someone almost impossibly good. Seeing her in person had only confirmed it. And what did he have to offer her? Silence. Awkwardness. The ability to talk to horses but not humans. Some husband he'd make. But he'd promised her honesty, hard work, and kindness. Those things at least he could deliver. Even if he couldn't deliver conversation, couldn't give her the companionship she probably wanted, he could give her those things. It would have to be enough. Because the alternative, getting back on that train, admitting defeat, returning to Ohio with his tail between his legs, was unthinkable. He'd spent his whole life being small, being quiet, letting the world dismiss him. This was his chance to be something more, even if more just meant being useful. Tomorrow, he'd start earning his place here. He'd fix things, work hard, make himself indispensable through action since words were beyond him. And maybe, if he was very lucky, Eliza would decide that was enough. Thomas finally drifted into uneasy sleep, unaware that downstairs Eliza was reading his journal by lamplight, discovering the depths he couldn't speak aloud, beginning to understand the man behind the silence. Neither of them knew yet that understanding would be the least of their challenges, that fire and fear and desperate circumstances would force truths into the open that neither could voice, that sometimes the most important words are the ones that don't need speaking. But that would come later. For now, they slept. Two strangers under one roof, separated by floors and uncertainty, bound by a contract and hope and the desperate need for something better than what they'd left behind. Outside, the mountain stood watch under cold stars, and the valley lay quiet, keeping its secrets. Morning came cold and bright, frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Eliza woke before dawn as always, her body trained by years of ranch work to rise with the sun. She dressed quickly in the chill air, pulling on her work dress and boots, then descended to the kitchen to start the stove. She was filling the coffee pot when she heard it, the distant ring of metal on metal, rhythmic and clear in the still morning air. Eliza stepped onto the porch, her breath misting in the cold. The sound was coming from the barn. She crossed the yard quickly, her boots crunching through frost, and found the barn doors already open, lamplight spilling out into the pre-dawn darkness. Thomas was inside, stripped down to his shirt despite the cold, working at her father's old anvil. He'd somehow managed to get the forge going, something Eliza hadn't touched in over a year, and was hammering at a piece of glowing metal. The motion was practiced, efficient, almost hypnotic. Strike, turn! Strike, turn! Sparks flew with each impact, and sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the morning chill. He hadn't heard her approach. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching him work. This was the Thomas she'd glimpsed with the horses, confident, capable, completely absorbed in his task. His hands moved with certainty, his whole body aligned with the work. There was no hesitation here, no fear. The metal began to take shape under his hammer, a hinge, she realized. He was making a new hinge for the barn door, the one that had broken last month and that she'd been meaning to replace. "You're up early," she said. Thomas startled violently, the hammer slipping in his grip. He caught it before it fell, then turned to face her, and she watched the transformation happen again, the confidence draining away, the shoulders hunching, the eyes dropping. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. Should have asked. Didn't mean to presume." It's fine," Eliza said, stepping into the barn. "That hinge has been broken for weeks. I'm grateful you're fixing it." Thomas nodded, not meeting her eyes. "Couldn't sleep. Figured I'd make myself useful." "How long have you been out here?" He shrugged, a gesture that might have meant an hour or might have meant since midnight. Knowing what she'd read in his journal last night, the anxiety, the desperate need to prove himself, Eliza suspected it was closer to the latter. "I'm making breakfast," she said. "Come inside when you're ready." She turned to leave, then paused. "Thomas, you don't have to earn your place here by working yourself to death. You're here because I invited you. That's enough." He looked at her then, just for a moment, and she saw something vulnerable and raw in his expression before he looked away again. "Thank you," he whispered. Back in the kitchen, Eliza made coffee and started breakfast. Eggs, bacon, biscuits from the dough she'd prepared the night before. She worked mechanically, her mind elsewhere. The journal sat on the table where she'd left it that morning after reading more entries by lamplight. She'd learned more about Thomas Avery in those pages than she'd gleaned from all their correspondence. He'd been mocked as a child, she'd discovered. The stutter had started young, after some trauma he didn't detail, and other children had been cruel. He'd learned early that silence was safer than speech, that keeping his head down and his mouth shut meant fewer bruises, less humiliation. He'd poured himself into work instead, learning his trade, becoming excellent at things that didn't require talking. His letters had been his salvation, the one place where words flowed freely because he had time to shape them, to get them right. "I can say on paper what I can't say out loud," one entry read. "Maybe that makes me a coward. Probably does. But at least this way, I can be understood. At least this way, someone might see past the broken parts." Eliza had cried, reading that. Then she'd been angry at whatever had hurt him as a child, angry at the people who'd made him feel broken, angry at a world that dismissed people for such arbitrary reasons. She heard his footsteps on the porch and quickly moved the journal, tucking it into the drawer of the sideboard. Thomas entered, having put his jacket back on, his face and hands freshly washed at the pump. "Sit," Eliza said, bringing plates to the table. "You've earned breakfast." They ate in the familiar silence, though Eliza noticed Thomas watching her between bites, as if trying to gauge her mood. She wondered if he knew she'd read his journal, if he was waiting for her judgment. "I was thinking," Eliza said, setting down her fork, "that we should discuss the work that needs doing. Make a plan. That way we can divide tasks and not duplicate efforts." Thomas nodded, attentive. "The barn roof is the priority," she continued. "Winter's coming fast, and if we don't fix it properly before the snow, we'll lose the whole structure. After that, the fence needs repair. We've got gaps that could let the horses out or let predators in. The chicken coop needs shoring up. The house could use work too, but that's less urgent." "I can do all that," Thomas said quietly. Then after a pause, "Roofing first. Good plan." "It's more than one man can handle alone," Eliza said. "I'll help. I've been managing on my own for a year. I know how to swing a hammer." Something flashed across Thomas's face, surprise maybe, or concern. "You've been alone for a year?" "Since my father died. Heart gave out last winter, sudden-like. One morning he was fine, by evening he was gone." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and the simple words held genuine sympathy. "That must have been hard." Is. Eliza looked down at her plate. "He built this place from nothing, spent 30 years making it work, and I've been watching it fall apart around me because I can't do it all myself. That's why," she gestured vaguely at Thomas, "why I needed help." "You're doing better than you think," Thomas said carefully. "The horses are healthy, well-fed. The land is good. You've kept the important things going. But not everything, not enough. Now you don't have to." Thomas looked at her directly, holding her gaze for longer than he had yet. "I'm here. I'll work hard. I promise you that." "I know you will," Eliza said softly. "I can see that already." They cleared the dishes together, then spent the morning working on the barn roof. Thomas climbed up first, evaluating the damage while Eliza gathered supplies. The work was hard and cold, but there was something satisfying about it. The simple physicality, the visible progress. And working side by side, Eliza discovered, was easier than sitting face to face. Thomas seemed to relax when his hands were busy. He didn't talk much, but he'd occasionally point out a problem spot or indicate where he needed her to hand up materials. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken communication through gesture and movement. By midday, they'd replaced a section of shingles and patched 2 major leaks. Thomas climbed down from the roof, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cold, and surveyed their work with what might have been satisfaction. "Good progress," he said. "We make a decent team," Eliza replied, and was rewarded with a small, fleeting smile. They ate lunch on the porch, bread and cheese and apples, simple food that didn't require going inside. The sun had warmed the afternoon enough to make it pleasant, and Eliza found herself studying Thomas as he ate, trying to reconcile all the different versions of him she was discovering. There was the terrified man from the train station, the confident worker at the forge, the gentle soul in his journal entries, the competent partner on the roof. Which one was the real Thomas Avery? Maybe they all were. Maybe people were more complicated than single stories. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza said. Thomas tensed immediately, but nodded. "Your letters were so eloquent. You wrote about books you'd read, ideas you'd had, observations about the world, but when you speak—" She trailed off, not wanting to hurt him. "It's different," Thomas finished for her. "I know. Why? What makes speaking so much harder than writing?" Thomas was quiet for a long time, his jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't swallow. Finally, he said, "When I write, I have time. Can think about each word. Get it right. But speaking," he made a frustrated gesture. "Words come too fast, can't organize them. They pile up in my throat and jam. Then people are waiting, staring, getting impatient. Makes it worse. Get so worried about how I sound that I can't get anything out." "You're worried about what I think," Eliza said gently. "Everyone," Thomas corrected. "Always, since I was 8 years old and— He stopped, shaking his head. "Sorry, can't talk about that." "That's all right. You don't have to tell me everything at once." Thomas looked at her with something like gratitude. "Most people don't understand, think I'm stupid or rude or just defective somehow." "I don't think any of those things," Eliza said firmly. "You're one of the most capable men I've ever met, Thomas. You're just quiet. There's nothing wrong with that. It makes things hard, though, for you, for this." He gestured between them, meaning the marriage arrangement. "Maybe," Eliza admitted, "but we're making it work, aren't we? We're figuring it out." "Are we?" Thomas's voice was almost desperate. "Honestly?" Eliza considered the question. 2 days ago, she'd been terrified she'd made a terrible mistake. Yesterday morning, she'd been frustrated and uncertain. But now, after working beside him, after reading his words and watching his actions, she felt something different. "Yes," she said. "I think we are." The relief on Thomas's face was profound. He ducked his head quickly, but not before she saw his eyes grow bright with emotion. They spent the afternoon working on the fence line, replacing broken rails and reinforcing weak posts. It was mindless work that left room for thought, and Eliza found herself planning ahead, not just for the next day or week, but for the winter, for spring, for the future of the ranch with Thomas as part of it. It felt strange to include someone else in those plans. For a year, she'd been alone with her decisions, her burdens, her fears. Now there was this silent man beside her, competent and steady, someone she was beginning to trust would actually stay. As the sun lowered toward the mountains, Thomas straightened from his work and pointed toward the house. Eliza looked and saw a rider approaching. Actually, several riders. She recognized them with a sinking feeling. Frank Sawyer and 2 of his hands from the neighboring ranch. Sawyer was a problem. He'd been trying to buy her out since her father's death, coming by every few months with increasingly aggressive offers. He was a large man, loud and prosperous, the kind of person who took up more space than he needed, and he'd made it clear he found the idea of a woman running a ranch amusing at best, insulting at worst. Friends of yours? Thomas asked quietly, noticing her expression. Hardly. That's Frank Sawyer. Owns the ranch to the west. He's been trying to force me to sell. You don't want to sell? This is my father's legacy. My home. I'm not giving it up without a fight. Thomas nodded once, then moved to stand beside her. Not in front of her, she noted with approval, but beside her. A subtle show of support. The riders pulled up at the fence line. Sawyer sat his horse like a man who owned the world, his belly straining against his vest, his face ruddy with good living or drink or both. Miss Monroe, he called out, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Didn't expect to see you out here doing manual labor. Thought you might have come to your senses and decided to take my offer. Mr. Sawyer, Eliza replied coolly, I've told you before, the ranch isn't for sale. Now, let's not be hasty. Sawyer's eyes slid to Thomas, assessingly. Who's this? Hired a hand, have you? That's good. Though I have to wonder how you're paying him, given your financial situation. Heat flooded Eliza's face. My finances are none of your concern. They are when you owe money to the bank, the same bank where I sit on the board. Sawyer smiled, showing teeth. Word gets around, Miss Monroe. You're 3 months behind on your loan payment. That's a precarious position for a woman alone. She's not alone. Everyone turned to look at Thomas. He'd spoken quietly, but with a firmness that cut through Sawyer's bluster. His eyes were fixed on Sawyer's face, direct and unyielding. Oh? Sawyer's eyebrows rose. And who might you be? Thomas's jaw clenched. Eliza could see the words jamming up in his throat, could see the panic starting to rise in his eyes. Without thinking, she stepped slightly forward, ready to intervene. But Thomas forced the words out. Thomas Avery, Miss Monroe's fiancé. The word came out too loud, too abrupt, but it came out. Eliza felt a rush of pride that surprised her. Sawyer's face darkened. Fiancé? That's convenient timing, isn't it? Where'd you come from, boy? Ohio, Thomas said. Thomas. Then clearly struggling, we're to be married. End of the week. A mail-order husband, Sawyer said with contempt. Good Lord, Eliza, you must be desperate. Ordering up some stranger from back east? You don't even know this man. I know him well enough, Eliza said sharply. And he's right. I'm not alone anymore. So you can take your offers and your concern and direct them elsewhere. This is a mistake, Sawyer said, his voice hardening. A woman like you needs guidance, not some... He waved dismissively at Thomas. What are you anyway? You talk like you've got marbles in your mouth. You simple-minded? What kind of man can Miss Monroe have found who'd be desperate enough to come out here for a failing ranch and a stubborn woman? Thomas flinched as if struck. Eliza saw his hands clench into fists, saw him take a step back. That's enough, she snapped. Get off my property, Frank. Now. Your property for now, Sawyer said. But when you can't make that loan payment, and you won't be able to, not with winter coming, the bank will foreclose. And I'll be first in line to buy this place for pennies on the dollar. You mark my words. He wheeled his horse around, his men following, and they rode off in a cloud of dust. Eliza stood rigid, anger and fear warring in her chest. The loan payment. She'd been trying not to think about it, but Sawyer was right. It was due in 6 weeks and she didn't have the money. She'd been hoping to sell some horses, but the market was poor and now winter was coming, and... Eliza? She turned to find Thomas watching her with concern. I'm fine, she said automatically. No, you're not. Thomas stepped closer. The loan, how much? $300, Eliza said quietly. Due the 1st of November. I have maybe half of it. We'll figure it out, Thomas said. Together. How? There's no way to earn that kind of money in 6 weeks. Not out here? Not this time of year? Then we'll find another way. Negotiate. Something. Thomas's hands flexed helplessly. I have some money from Ohio. Not much, but you can have it. I can't take your savings, Thomas. Why not? This is my ranch too now, isn't it? Or will be. After we couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Eliza looked at him. This man who'd arrived 2 days ago, who could barely speak to her, who was now offering her everything he had. The gesture overwhelmed her. "Thank you," she said softly. "But even with your savings, I doubt it would be enough. We need to think bigger." They walked back to the house in heavy silence. The encounter with Sawyer had cast a pall over the day's earlier successes. Inside, Eliza moved through the motions of making dinner, her mind racing through possibilities and discarding them just as quickly. Sell more horses? They needed the breeding stock. Sell land? She'd have to sell to Sawyer, and the thought made her sick. Take out another loan? No bank would lend to her now. Find work in town? There was no work. And who would run the ranch? Thomas watched her from across the kitchen, his expression troubled. Finally, he cleared his throat. I could take work in town. Shoeing horses, repair work, bring in money. That's 6 weeks of work for maybe $50 if you're lucky, Eliza said. It's not enough. Then what? I don't know. The words came out sharper than she intended. I don't know, Thomas. I've been racking my brain for months trying to figure out how to save this place, and I'm out of ideas. Maybe Sawyer's right. Maybe I'm just being stubborn. Maybe the smart thing would be to sell while I can still get something for it. You don't mean that, Thomas said quietly. Don't I? Maybe I'm fighting a losing battle. Maybe I should cut my losses and… No. Thomas's voice was firm, almost fierce. No. You don't give up. I saw your face when you talked about your father. About this place. It matters. It's worth fighting for. Even if the fight is hopeless, nothing's hopeless. Thomas moved closer, and for once he didn't look away. I came here with almost nothing. Just hope. Just a chance at something better. You gave me that. Let me help you fight, however I can. Eliza felt tears sting her eyes. Why? You barely know me. This isn't your problem. It is, though, Thomas said simply, because I'm here. Because you let me be here. Because… He struggled with the words, his face contorting with effort. Because I want it to be. Want this to be my home. My fight, too. The tears spilled over. Eliza wiped them away quickly, embarrassed. I'm sorry. It's been a long day. Don't apologize. Thomas reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he seemed to lose his nerve and pulled back. You're allowed to be overwhelmed. It's a lot. Too much for one person. For two people, Eliza corrected with a watery smile. For two people, Thomas agreed. But two is better than one. They ate dinner quietly, the weight of their problems sitting heavy at the table with them. Afterward, Thomas helped clean up again, then excused himself to his room. Eliza heard him moving around upstairs, heard the creak of the bed as he settled in to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with her father's ledgers spread before her, trying once more to make the numbers work. But they wouldn't cooperate. No matter how she added and subtracted, shuffled and rearranged, she came up short, always short. She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Thomas appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, his hair disheveled from lying down. Can't sleep? Eliza asked. He shook his head. Kept thinking about the money, about Sawyer. He hesitated, then came to sit across from her. Can I see the books? Eliza slid the ledgers across the table. Thomas studied them carefully, his finger tracing down columns of numbers. She watched his face, seeing concentration there, intelligence working through the problem. Your father kept good records, Thomas said finally. He was meticulous, taught me everything he knew. These horses here, Thomas pointed to a list, says they're good breeding stock, valuable. They are. That's why I can't sell them. Without breeding stock, there's no future. But what if… Thomas paused, organizing his thoughts. What if you didn't sell them? What if you leased them out? For breeding? To other ranches? Eliza blinked. Lease them. People pay good money for quality bloodlines. You'd keep ownership, but they'd pay for breeding rights. Could bring in money without losing the assets. That's Eliza felt her mind start to race. That's actually brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? Because you've been alone, Thomas said gently, trying to solve everything yourself. Sometimes you just need fresh eyes. Eliza grabbed a pencil and started calculating. If she could lease out 3 of her best studs for breeding and maybe 2 of the proven mares, the numbers started to look different. Not perfect, but possible. It might work, she breathed. If I can find enough ranchers who want to improve their stock, it might actually work. I can help, Thomas offered. Could ride to neighboring ranches. Ask around. I'm better with horses than people anyway. They worked late into the night, making lists of potential ranchers to approach, calculating what they'd need to charge, planning out how to make it all work. And something happened in those quiet hours of collaboration. A shift, subtle but significant. They stopped being 2 separate people thrust together by circumstance and became something more like partners. Thomas's stutter was still there, his silences still frequent. But Eliza found she was learning to read him in other ways, in the furrow of his brow when he concentrated, in the slight smile when he had an idea, in the way his hands moved when he couldn't find words, gesturing instead. And Thomas, for his part, seemed to relax incrementally as the night wore on. Not enough to speak easily, but enough to speak more, to offer ideas without second-guessing himself into silence, to look at her when he talked instead of at the table. Thank you, Eliza said finally, when they'd exhausted their planning and the candle was burning low. For this, for not giving up on me. Never, Thomas said quietly. I don't give up easy. On anything worth keeping. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement of what they were building here. Not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but something just as valuable: respect, trust, partnership. We should sleep, Eliza said, though she was reluctant to break the moment. We have a lot of work ahead of us. Thomas nodded and stood, gathering the blanket around himself. At the doorway, he paused. Eliza? About earlier, with Sawyer, what he said about me being desperate, or you being... He struggled with the words. He's a cruel man who wants what he can't have, Eliza said firmly. Don't let his words hurt you. They don't, Thomas said, and she was surprised to realize he meant it. I know what I am, know my limitations, but I also know what I can offer, and it's not nothing. It's definitely not nothing, Eliza agreed. Thomas smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. Good night, Eliza. Good night, Thomas. She watched him climb the stairs, then sat alone in the darkness for a long time, thinking about the strange turns life could take. A week ago, she'd been alone and desperate, ready to try anything to save her home. She'd sent for a husband the way one might send for supplies, a practical solution to a practical problem. But Thomas Avery was turning out to be much more than a practical solution. He was turning into a friend, and maybe, given time, something even more. The next few days fell into a rhythm. They rose with the sun and worked until dark, making progress on the seemingly endless list of repairs. Thomas proved his worth a dozen times over, fixing things Eliza didn't even know were broken, anticipating problems before they occurred, working with the quiet competence of someone who truly understood his craft. And Eliza, in turn, made good on their plan. She spent her afternoons riding to neighboring ranches, pitching her breeding lease idea. The first few ranchers were skeptical. A woman running a breeding operation seemed unlikely to them. But Eliza had her father's reputation behind her, and Thomas's solid work to point to. Slowly, she began to get agreements. Each evening, they'd sit at the kitchen table and tally up their progress. How much they'd earned, how much they still needed. The gap was closing, not quickly enough to make her comfortable, but closing nonetheless. Through it all, Thomas remained a constant presence, quiet but steady, awkward but reliable. He'd leave wildflowers on the kitchen table sometimes, picked on his morning walks. He'd make sure the stove was stocked with wood before she woke. He'd notice when she was tired and wordlessly take over whatever task she was struggling with. Small kindnesses, all of them, but they accumulated like snow, building into something substantial. One evening, nearly a week after Thomas's arrival, Eliza found him in the barn with one of the horses, Daisy, the abused mare who'd never trusted anyone. Thomas sat in her stall, speaking to her in low, gentle tones. Daisy's head was resting against his chest, her eyes half closed in contentment. "You have a gift," Eliza said from the doorway. Thomas looked up, startled. "She's just lonely. Needed someone to listen." "Is that what you do? Listen to them?" "They tell you things, if you pay attention, where they hurt, what they're afraid of, what they need." He stroked Daisy's neck. "She needed to know someone wouldn't hurt her, that she's safe. And you showed her that." "Tried to. Animals are easier than people, more honest." Eliza came into the stall, moving slowly so as not to spook Daisy. The mare's ears flicked toward her, but she didn't pull away. "Progress." "People can be honest too," Eliza said, "when they feel safe." Thomas met her eyes, understanding the subtext. "Are you asking if I feel safe? Here?" "I suppose I am." He was quiet for a long moment, his hand still moving over Daisy's coat in long, soothing strokes. "Safer than I've felt in a long time. Maybe ever." "Good," Eliza said. "That's how it should be. This is your home now, Thomas. However this marriage works out, whatever we become to each other, you have a place here." "Thank you," Thomas whispered. That means more than I can say." "You don't have to say it. I can see it." They stood together in the warm dimness of the barn, the horse breathing softly between them, and Eliza thought about visibility, about being seen. Thomas had worried his whole life that people saw only his stutter, his awkwardness, his inability to speak smoothly. But she was learning to see past all that to the man beneath, kind, perceptive, steadier than stone. And maybe, just maybe, he was learning to see her too. Not as the desperate woman who'd advertised for a husband, not as the failing rancher everyone pitied, but as someone capable and strong, someone worth standing beside. The wedding was supposed to happen in 3 days. They hadn't talked about it directly, had been avoiding the topic through mutual unspoken agreement, but it hung there between them, a question neither was quite ready to answer. That night, after another quiet dinner, Thomas pulled out his journal, but instead of retreating upstairs with it, he sat at the kitchen table and began to write while Eliza cleaned up. She watched him from the corner of her eye, curious. When he was finished, he tore out the page and slid it across the table to her. Eliza dried her hands and picked it up. "I know the wedding is soon," it read in Thomas's careful script, "and I know we haven't talked about whether it should still happen. I understand if you've changed your mind, if you want more time or want to call it off entirely. I wouldn't blame you, but I want you to know that if you're willing to take a chance on me, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of it. I'll work hard and stay faithful and do everything I can to help you keep this ranch. I may not be able to say the vows smoothly, but I mean them. Every word. The choice is yours, Eliza. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." Eliza read the words twice, 3 times, feeling emotion swell in her throat. When she looked up, Thomas was watching her with apprehension written clear on his face. "You've already been worthy of it," she said, "every single day since you arrived. I think," she took a breath, "I think we should go ahead with the wedding, not because of the ranch or the money or any practical reason, but because I want to. Because you're a good man, Thomas Avery, and I'd be proud to be your wife." The relief and joy that flooded Thomas's expression was beautiful to see. He started to speak, couldn't, tried again. Finally, he just nodded, his eyes bright, and reached across the table to take her hand. His grip was warm and steady, and Eliza held on tight, feeling like she'd just made the most important decision of her life. They sat like that as the candle burned down, 2 people who'd started as strangers, joined now by choice and hope, and the beginning of something that felt remarkably like love. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, the kind of October day where frost clung to everything until mid-morning and the sky stretched blue and endless overhead. Eliza woke early, her stomach tight with nerves that surprised her. This wasn't supposed to be a love match, she reminded herself. This was practical, sensible. They'd made a business arrangement that had evolved into friendship, and now they were making it legal. So why did her hands shake as she brushed out her hair? She'd chosen her mother's dress, pale blue calico with cream lace at the collar and cuffs. It was simple, appropriate for a quiet ceremony at the church in town. She'd altered it herself over the past 2 evenings while Thomas worked in the barn, letting out seams that her mother's smaller frame had needed, shortening the hem to account for her own height. Looking at herself in the mirror now, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. She looked younger somehow, less worn down. The past week and a half of having help, of not carrying every burden alone, had softened something in her face. A soft knock on her bedroom door made her turn. "Eliza, we should leave soon. Don't want to be late." Thomas's voice through the door was tight with its own nervousness. She opened it to find him standing in the hallway, transformed. He'd somehow procured a proper suit, dark wool, well-fitted, with a vest and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved. He looked like a different man from the dusty, frightened stranger who'd stepped off the train 10 days ago. He looked like a groom. "You look—" Thomas's eyes widened as he took her in. "You're beautiful." The words came out in a rush, unplanned, and he immediately flushed. But he didn't look away this time. He held her gaze, and she saw wonder there, and something that might have been the beginning of love. "Thank you," Eliza said softly. "You look very handsome yourself. Where did you get the suit?" "Had it made, in town, last few days." He ducked his head. "Wanted to look proper, for you." "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to." Thomas offered his arm, formal and sweet. "Ready?" Eliza took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him through the wool. "Ready." The ride to town was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than those first painful days. This silence held anticipation, nerves, but also a settling certainty. They were doing this, actually doing this. By the time they returned to the ranch this afternoon, they'd be husband and wife. Willow Creek's church was a small white building at the edge of town, its steeple pointing skyward like a prayer. Reverend Morrison was waiting on the steps when they arrived, along with his wife who'd agreed to serve as witness. The Reverend was an elderly man with kind eyes and a voice gentled by years of comforting the grieving. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Avery," he greeted them warmly. "A fine day for a wedding." "Thank you for doing this on short notice, Reverend," Eliza said. "My pleasure, my pleasure. Shall we proceed inside?" The church was empty, save for the four of them, sunlight streaming through the plain glass windows and illuminating the simple wooden pews. It smelled of beeswax and old hymn books, familiar and comforting. Eliza had been baptized here, had attended services here every Sunday of her childhood. Her parents had been married here. Now it was her turn. They took their places before the altar, Thomas on her right, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles showed white. Eliza wanted to reach over and touch him, offer some comfort, but Reverend Morrison was already beginning. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Eliza. She'd heard them at other weddings, had imagined her own wedding day in vague, girlish ways when she was younger. She'd pictured a church full of people, flowers everywhere, a celebration, not this quiet, practical ceremony with only 2 witnesses. But looking at Thomas beside her, his jaw set with determination, his eyes focused straight ahead, she found she didn't mind. This felt right, honest, no pretense, no performance, just 2 people making promises they intended to keep. "Thomas Avery," Reverend Morrison said, turning to him, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Thomas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Eliza's heart clenched. She saw panic flash across his face, saw his throat work as he tried to force the words through. Reverend Morrison waited patiently, but Mrs. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, and Eliza could feel Thomas's humiliation radiating off him in waves. Without thinking, she reached over and took his hand. Thomas's head snapped toward her, surprise in his eyes. She squeezed his fingers gently, offering him her strength, her support. "You can do this," she tried to say without words. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." Thomas took a shaking breath, then another. His grip on her hand tightened until it was almost painful. "I do," he said. The words were rough, too loud in the quiet church, but they were clear. "I do." Relief flooded Eliza so powerfully she felt dizzy. Reverend Morrison smiled and turned to her. Eliza Monroe, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part? I do, Eliza said firmly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Reverend Morrison beamed at them. You may kiss your bride, young man. Thomas froze, clearly not having thought this far ahead. Eliza watched the panic return to his face and decided to save them both the awkwardness. She rose up on her toes and pressed a quick, chaste kiss to his cheek. There, she whispered. Official. Official, Thomas echoed, something like awe in his voice. They signed the marriage certificate with Mrs. Morrison and the Reverend as witnesses, Eliza's neat script next to Thomas's careful letters. Married. It was done. They were husband and wife. Outside the church, Reverend Morrison shook Thomas's hand. Congratulations to you both. I hope you'll find great happiness together. Thank you, Thomas managed. We'll try. That's all any of us can do, the Reverend said kindly. Marriage is work, but it's good work, worth doing. They climbed back into the wagon and Thomas took up the reins. But before he clicked to the horses, he turned to Eliza. Thank you, he said quietly, for your hand. During the vows. I couldn't have done it without that. We're partners now, Eliza said. That means helping each other through the hard parts. Partners, Thomas repeated, as if testing the word. I like that. They were halfway back to the ranch when they saw the smoke. It rose in a thick black column from the direction of their property, visible for miles against the clear sky. Thomas saw it first, his body going rigid. Eliza, he said, his voice tight. She followed his gaze and felt her heart drop into her stomach. No, 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 no. Thomas didn't wait for permission. He snapped the reins hard, sending the horses into a gallop. The wagon jolted and bounced over the rough road, but neither of them cared. All Eliza could see was that smoke, getting thicker and darker as they got closer. Please, she prayed, please not the house, please not the barn with all the horses. They crested the final rise and the full scene came into view. The barn. The barn was burning, flames already engulfing the western side, smoke pouring from the hayloft. And worse, much worse, she could hear the horses screaming. They're still inside, Eliza gasped. Oh God, the horses are still inside. Thomas didn't respond. The moment the wagon slowed enough, he jumped down and started running toward the barn. Eliza scrambled down after him, her wedding dress tangling around her legs. Thomas, wait! It's too dangerous! But he wasn't listening. He grabbed a water bucket from the trough, dumped it over his head and shoulders, then ran straight into the burning barn. Eliza's scream caught in her throat. For a moment she stood frozen, watching the man she'd married less than an hour ago disappear into the inferno. Then training took over. She ran to the pump, started filling buckets, her mind racing. The fire was too big to fight, but maybe she could slow it, contain it somehow. Inside the barn, Thomas could barely see through the smoke. His eyes burned and tears streamed down his face, but he pushed forward. The horses were panicking, throwing themselves against their stall doors. Bess, Copper, Daisy, the others. They were going to die if he didn't get them out. Easy, he called, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. Easy, I've got you. He reached the first stall, Copper, and threw the bolt. The horse exploded out, nearly trampling him in its terror, but it ran for the open door in safety. Thomas moved to the next stall, and the next, working methodically even as the heat grew unbearable, and burning debris began falling from the loft above. He'd freed 5 horses when part of the roof collapsed behind him, cutting off his exit. Flames roared up, feeding on fresh oxygen, and for a moment Thomas's courage faltered. The smoke was so thick he couldn't breathe, couldn't see. He'd lost track of which direction was out. Then he heard it. A scream, terrified and unmistakably human. Eliza. The sound cut through his panic like a knife. He couldn't die here. She needed him. They were partners now, married, bound together. He'd made promises less than an hour ago. Thomas dropped to his hands and knees where the air was slightly clearer. 3 more stalls, 3 more horses. He crawled forward, found the next door through the bolt. The horse thundered past him. Another stall, another bolt. His hands were burning now, blistered from the hot metal, but he kept moving. The last stall was Daisy's. She was pressed into the far corner, frozen with terror. Thomas knew that look, knew what trauma did to the mind, how it could paralyze you even when staying meant death. He'd felt that same paralysis countless times in his life, trapped by his own fear and inadequacy. Not today. "Daisy," he called, his voice barely audible over the roar of flames. "Come on, girl. Trust me, please." He crawled into her stall, grabbed her halter. She tried to rear away, but he held firm, pulling her forward with strength, born of desperation. "I won't let you die here. Come on!" Something in his voice must have reached her. Daisy stopped fighting and followed him out of the stall, her body trembling violently. Thomas wrapped his hand in her mane and let her lead him. Horses could sense their way out of smoke better than humans. She picked her way forward, stepping over burning boards, and suddenly they were at the door, tumbling out into blessed fresh air. Thomas's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the dirt, gasping and coughing, Daisy standing over him protectively. Through watering eyes, he saw Eliza running toward him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "You stupid, brave, impossible man," she sobbed, dropping to her knees beside him. "What were you thinking?" "The horses," Thomas wheezed. "Couldn't let them." "They're safe. They're all safe." "You got them all out." She was patting him down frantically, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "Thomas, talk to me. Are you hurt?" "Hands," he managed. "Burns. But I'm okay." Eliza grabbed his hands, turning them over to see the angry red blisters covering his palms and fingers. She looked back at the barn, which was now fully engulfed, the flames reaching high into the afternoon sky. There was no saving it. They could only watch it burn. "How did this start?" she said. "I banked the forge yesterday, made sure everything was cold." Thomas shook his head, still coughing. "Don't know, but Eliza, this wasn't an accident." "What do you mean?" "Look." He pointed toward the yard with one burned hand. "No wind today. Fire spread too fast. Too even." He coughed again, wincing. "Someone set this. On purpose." The words settled over Eliza like ice water. Someone had done this deliberately, burned their barn, tried to kill their horses, on their wedding day, when they'd both been gone. "Sawyer," she breathed. "It has to be Sawyer." "Can't prove it," Thomas said. But yes, probably." They sat together in the dirt, watching the barn burn, smoke rolling up into the perfect blue sky. All their work on the roof, all the repairs Thomas had made, all of it was turning to ash. The forge was in there, the tack, the feed stores they'd laid in for winter, gone. But the horses were safe. The house was untouched, and they were alive. "I thought you were going to die," Eliza said quietly. "When that roof collapsed and I couldn't see you anymore, I thought—" Her voice broke. "We've been married an hour, Thomas. 1 hour. I can't lose you already." Thomas looked at her, this woman who'd taken a chance on a broken stranger, who'd seen worth in him when few others had. Her wedding dress was ruined, covered in soot and dirt. Her hair had come loose from its careful arrangement and hung wild around her shoulders. She looked fierce and terrified and beautiful. "You won't," he said, each word costing him effort through his raw throat. "Lose me. I promise. It takes more than fire to kill me. Don't joke about this." "Not joking." Thomas lifted one burned hand and very gently touched her face. "Made vows today. Meant them. In sickness and in health. This counts." Eliza caught his hand, holding it carefully against her cheek despite the blisters. "You saved them all, every single horse. Do you know how rare that is? How brave." "Not brave, just necessary." "It was brave," Eliza insisted, "and I won't forget it, ever." Neighbors started arriving then, drawn by the smoke. They helped contain the fire, kept it from spreading to the house or other outbuildings. Someone brought salve for Thomas's burns and wrapped his hands in clean cloth. Someone else gathered the scattered horses and got them settled in the far pasture. The whole community turned out, the way communities did in crisis. Even Frank Sawyer showed up, though he kept his distance. Eliza watched him through narrowed eyes, looking for any sign of guilt. But if he'd done this, and she was certain he had, he was too clever to show it. He expressed sympathy, offered to buy her out for a fair price now that she'd suffered such a loss, and left when she told him exactly where he could put his offer. By evening, the fire had burned itself out. All that remained of the barn was a blackened skeleton of support beams and ash. Years of her father's work, destroyed in hours. The neighbors dispersed slowly, promising to return tomorrow to help with cleanup. Finally, Eliza and Thomas were alone again, standing in their yard looking at the destruction. "What do we do now?" Eliza asked. "We can't make the loan payment and rebuild. It's one or the other, and neither one is possible." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, swaying slightly on his feet. The day's events were clearly catching up with him. The wedding, the terror, the smoke inhalation, the burns. He looked ready to collapse. "Tomorrow," he said finally. "We figure it out. Tomorrow. Tonight. Tonight we just survive." It was perhaps the wisest thing anyone had said to her in months. Sometimes survival was enough. Sometimes it had to be. She took his arm, careful of his bandaged hands, and led him inside. The house smelled of smoke. Their clothes were ruined and their barn was gone. But they were alive and together, and that would have to be sufficient for now. Eliza settled Thomas in a chair and brought water, made him drink even though swallowing clearly pained him. Then she unwrapped his hands to examine the burns. They were bad. Second degree at least, the skin angry and weeping. He'd be weeks healing, and he might have scars. "This is going to hurt," she warned, reaching for the salve. "Already hurts," Thomas said. "Can't get much worse." He was wrong. As she cleaned and treated the burns, he went white with pain, his jaw clenched so tight she feared he'd crack a tooth. But he didn't cry out, didn't pull away. He just endured, the way he'd probably endured a lifetime of smaller injuries. When she finished rewrapping his hands, Thomas sagged in the chair. "Thank you," he whispered. "You should rest. Go upstairs. Lie down." "You too. You're exhausted." Eliza realized he was right. She was shaking with fatigue, her muscles screaming from the day's exertion. But more than that, she was shaking with delayed fear. The reality of how close they'd come to losing everything, including Thomas, was finally hitting her. "I don't want to be alone right now," she admitted. Thomas looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "Neither do I." They climbed the stairs together, Thomas moving slowly, Eliza hovering in case he stumbled. At the top, they stood in the hallway between their two rooms. The arrangement had been clear, separate quarters until they chose otherwise, but that had been before the fire, before nearly losing each other. "You could," Thomas started, then stopped. Tried again. "My room. There's space. We could just sleep. Nothing else. Just not be alone." Eliza nodded, grateful he'd said it first. "Yes, I'd like that." His room was sparse. He hadn't accumulated much in his short time here. But the bed was large enough for two, and honestly, Eliza was too tired to care about propriety. They were married now. If people wanted to judge, let them. She helped Thomas out of his ruined suit jacket and vest. He managed his boots with her help, wincing as the movement pulled at his burned hands. Eliza took off her own shoes and the outer layer of her destroyed wedding dress, leaving her in her chemise and petticoats. They lay down on opposite sides of the bed, a careful distance between them. The windows were open, bringing in the smell of char and ash from outside. The pillow smelled like Thomas, soap and horses and smoke now. Eliza closed her eyes and tried to will her racing heart to slow. "Eliza? Yes?" "Today didn't go how I imagined." A laugh escaped her, slightly hysterical. "No, not quite the wedding day dreams are made of. But we made it through." "We did. That counts for something." Eliza turned her head on the pillow to look at him. In the dim light, she could just make out his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. This man who'd run into fire for her horses, who'd somehow gotten his vows out despite his terror, who was lying here now, hurt and exhausted, trying to comfort her. "It counts for everything," she said softly. Thomas turned toward her, their eyes meeting in the darkness. Very slowly, carefully, he reached out with his bandaged hand. Eliza took it gently, mindful of his injuries, and held on. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped between them, two people who'd started the day as almost strangers and ended it as something far more profound. Partners. Survivors. A team. And outside, the ruins of the barn smoldered under the stars, a testament to destruction survived and the strength required to keep going when everything tried to break you. Morning came too soon, gray light filtering through the windows along with the acrid smell of wet ash. Someone had doused the barn remnants during the night to prevent any rekindling. Eliza woke to find herself pressed against Thomas's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. Sometime in the night, they'd gravitated together, seeking comfort and warmth. She lay still for a moment, listening to his heartbeat, steady and strong. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and even despite what must be considerable pain from his hands. In sleep, his face was peaceful, the lines of worry and self-consciousness smoothed away. He looked younger, softer, like someone who hadn't spent his whole life being afraid. Eliza carefully extracted herself and went downstairs. Her whole body ached, muscles protesting yesterday's exertions. In the kitchen, she started coffee and tried to think practically about their situation. The barn was gone. The loan payment was still due. Their breeding lease plan was now significantly complicated without a proper barn to house visiting stock, and someone, almost certainly Sawyer, had tried to destroy them. She was making a list of what needed doing first when Thomas came down the stairs, moving gingerly. He'd put his shirt back on, though he clearly struggled with the buttons given his bandaged hands. "Let me," Eliza said, crossing to help him. Her fingers worked the buttons efficiently, trying not to notice the warmth of his skin beneath the fabric, the steady rise and fall of his chest. "How do your hands feel?" "Painful," Thomas admitted, but I'll manage." "You need to rest them today. Let them start healing." "Too much to do. Can't rest." "Thomas." "No." His voice was firm despite the rasp. "Someone burned our barn, tried to ruin us. I won't let them. Won't give Sawyer the satisfaction." Eliza finished with the buttons and looked up at him. His jaw was set with determination, his eyes fierce. This was a different Thomas from the frightened man at the train station. This was someone who'd been tested and found he had steel in his spine. "All right," she said, "but you let me do the heavy work. You supervise and plan." "Deal." They spent the morning sorting through the barn ruins, salvaging what they could. Some tools had survived, their metal handles scorched but usable. A few pieces of tack stored in a metal trunk were intact, but most of it was lost. Years of accumulated equipment and supplies gone. Several neighbors returned to help, good people who understood how precarious survival was out here, how quickly fortune could turn. Together they cleared away the worst of the debris, creating space to eventually rebuild. But rebuilding would require money and time they didn't have. By afternoon, Eliza was ready to collapse. They'd made progress, but the scope of the loss was overwhelming. She sat on the porch steps, head in her hands, trying not to cry from pure frustration. Thomas lowered himself down beside her, wincing as his burned hands bumped against his legs. For a while they just sat in silence, looking out at their damaged property. "We could sell," Eliza said finally. "Take Sawyer's offer, cut our losses." "Do you want to?" "No, but I don't see another way." Thomas was quiet, thinking. What if we asked for help? From who? Everyone. The town. Other ranchers. He struggled to articulate his idea. People help today because that's what neighbors do. What if we organize something, a barn raising? We provide materials. They provide labor? Thomas, we can't afford materials. We barely have enough for the loan payment if all our breeding leases come through. Then we delay the payment. Ask the bank for an extension. Explain what happened. Banks don't care about barn fires. They care about money. But people care. Thomas turned to face her, earnest and intense. That's what I've learned here, in this place. People care. They showed up today. They'll show up again if we ask. Eliza wanted to believe him, wanted to think that community goodwill could somehow solve their problems. But she'd seen how the world worked. Money talked, and they had none. Sympathy wouldn't rebuild a barn or pay off debts. Still, Thomas was looking at her with such hope, such conviction, and he'd earned the right to have his ideas heard. "All right," she said. "We can try. But if it doesn't work, we'll have to consider selling." "It'll work," Thomas said with surprising confidence. "People here are good. Better than I expected. Better than where I came from." He stood and offered her his bandaged hand. Eliza took it carefully and let him pull her to her feet. They were filthy, exhausted, facing impossible odds. But they were facing them together, and somehow that made all the difference. "Thank you," Eliza said, "for not giving up." "Never," Thomas said simply. "We're partners, remember? We don't give up on partners." That evening they sat at the kitchen table and drafted a letter to the bank, explaining the situation and requesting a 60-day extension on their loan payment. Thomas insisted on writing it himself despite his injured hands, working slowly and carefully to make each word clear. Then they drafted another letter to be posted around town, explaining their barn-raising plan and asking for volunteers. They'd provide food and whatever materials they could afford. In exchange, they'd offer their labor for any future community projects, a promise to pay forward the help they received. It was audacious and possibly foolish, but it was better than surrender. Before bed, Eliza checked Thomas's bandages again, changing the dressings and applying fresh salve. The burns were angry and weeping, and she knew he had to be in considerable pain, but he bore it stoically, never complaining. "You should have been more careful," she said, though there was no real reproach in it. "You could have died in there. So could the horses. Horses can be replaced. You can't." Thomas looked at her, startled. "You really mean that?" "Of course I do. You're my husband now. Even if this started as an arrangement, it's become more than that. To me, anyway." "To me too," Thomas said quietly. "More than I expected. More than I deserve." "Don't say that. You deserve everything good this world has to offer." He smiled, small and sad. "I used to think I didn't deserve anything, that my stutter was punishment for something. Being born wrong. I don't know." "You're not wrong," Eliza said fiercely. "There's nothing wrong with you, Thomas Avery. You're brave and kind and capable. The fact that words are hard for you doesn't change any of that. Sometimes feels like it's all anyone sees. Then they're not looking properly." She finished wrapping his hands and sat back. "I see you, the real you, and I like what I see." Thomas's eyes grew bright. He opened his mouth, struggled with words for a moment, then did something unexpected. He leaned forward and kissed her, quick and gentle and chaste. When he pulled back, he was blushing furiously. "Sorry, couldn't find words for how that made me feel, so I—" "It's all right," Eliza said softly, her heart racing. "Sometimes actions speak louder anyway." They went upstairs together again, and again they shared his bed. But this time there was no pretense about it being only for comfort. They held each other deliberately, intimately, a married couple beginning to discover what that meant. And as Eliza drifted to sleep in her husband's arms, listening to his breathing slow and steady, she thought about the strange paths life took, how desperation had led her to place an advertisement for a husband, how a frightened, silent man had answered, how fire and fear had forged them into something stronger than either had been alone. She didn't know if they could save the ranch, didn't know if Sawyer would try again to destroy them, didn't know if the bank would grant their extension or the town would show up to help rebuild. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't facing any of it alone anymore, and that made all the difference in the world. The response to their letters came faster than either of them expected. Within 3 days, word had spread throughout the valley about the barn fire and their plan to rebuild. Ranchers began stopping by, some offering lumber they could spare, others promising labor on the designated day. The general store owner in town donated nails and hardware at cost. Even people Eliza barely knew showed up with food or supplies. their faces set with the quiet determination of those who understood that survival out here meant looking out for one another. But it was the bank's response that surprised them most. Thomas had ridden into town to check for mail, his hands still bandaged but healing well enough to manage the rains. He returned with an envelope bearing the bank's seal, his expression unreadable. Eliza took it from him with shaking fingers and opened it at the kitchen table while he watched. She read it once, then again, unable to believe the words. "They're granting the extension. 60 days, just like we asked. They're even reducing the interest during that period." "Why would they do that?" Thomas asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "The letter says," Eliza scanned the formal language. "It says they received several letters from community members vouching for our character and work ethic, and that the bank manager's wife was quite insistent that we be given a fair chance after the fire." She looked up at Thomas in wonder. "People we barely know went to bat for us." "Told you," Thomas said, and there was satisfaction in his voice. "Told you people here were good." Eliza felt tears sting her eyes. For so long she'd felt alone, isolated in her struggle to keep her father's ranch alive. She'd been too proud to ask for help, too frightened of being seen as weak. But Thomas's arrival had changed something fundamental. His belief in the goodness of their neighbors, his willingness to be vulnerable and ask for assistance, had opened doors she'd kept firmly closed. "You were right," she said, "about all of it. I was so focused on being strong alone that I forgot there's strength in community too." "You were strong," Thomas said firmly. "You kept this place running by yourself for a year. That's incredible. You just don't have to anymore." She crossed to him and hugged him carefully, mindful of his healing hands. He went still for a moment in surprise, then wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other, and Eliza marveled at how natural it felt. How right. The barn raising was set for the following Saturday. In the days leading up to it, Thomas worked despite Eliza's protests about his hands. He couldn't do heavy labor yet, but he could plan, measure, sketch out designs. He spent hours at this kitchen table with paper and pencil, drawing up plans for a new barn that would be more efficient than the old one, with better ventilation and stall arrangements that would make daily work easier. "Where did you learn to do this?" Eliza asked, looking over his shoulder at the detailed drawings. "Taught myself. Used to help the barn builder back in Ohio. Watched, learned." Thomas tapped the paper with his bandaged finger. "This design here, see? Allows for better airflow, reduces fire risk, and these stalls, easier to clean, more space for the horses." "It's brilliant," Eliza said honestly. "You have a gift for this." Thomas ducked his head, pleased. "Just practical thinking." "It's more than that. You see how things could be better, not just how they are." He looked at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. "That's what I hoped for. Coming here. A chance to be better than I was. Make something better than what I had." You're already better than you think," Eliza said softly. "You just needed someone to see it." The night before the barn raising, Eliza couldn't sleep. She lay beside Thomas in the darkness, listening to his steady breathing, her mind racing with logistics and worries. What if not enough people showed up? What if they did show up but the project was too ambitious? What if Sawyer found some way to sabotage their efforts? "You're thinking too loud," Thomas murmured beside her. "Sorry. Did I wake you?" "No, can feel you worrying. What's wrong?" Eliza rolled toward him, just barely able to make out his face in the moonlight filtering through the window. "What if this doesn't work? What if we fail?" "Then we try something else." Thomas reached out, his bandaged hand finding hers in the dark. "But we won't fail. Not with this many people helping." "How can you be so confident?" "Because I've seen what you're capable of, what they're capable of, what we're capable of together." He squeezed her hand gently. "Faith, Eliza. Sometimes you just need faith. I'm not good at that. Faith requires trusting things you can't control." "I know. But you trusted me. Stranger from the train. That took faith." Eliza considered this. He was right. Taking a chance on Thomas had been an act of pure faith, a leap into the unknown, and it had turned out better than she could have imagined. You're different from when you arrived, she said. More confident, stronger somehow. Feel different. You, you make me feel like I can be more than I thought, like maybe I'm not as broken as I believed. You were never broken, just afraid. Same thing, sometimes. No, Eliza said firmly. Afraid is temporary. Broken is permanent. You were always whole, Thomas. You just needed the right place to prove it. She felt him shift closer, his forehead resting against hers. Thank you, he whispered, for seeing that, for giving me the chance. Thank you for taking it, for not running when things got hard. Where would I run to? Thomas said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. This is home now. You're home. The simple declaration made her chest tight with emotion. You're home for me too. They kissed then, soft and slow, a promise and a comfort all at once. And when they finally drifted to sleep, tangled together beneath the quilts, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in over a year. Hope that was more than desperate wishful thinking. Hope grounded in something real and solid and true. Saturday dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for building. By sunrise, wagons were already rolling up the drive, carrying families and supplies and tools. Eliza and Thomas stood on the porch, watching them arrive, overwhelmed by the turnout. 20 families at least, maybe more. Everyone from neighboring ranchers to townspeople who'd never set foot on her property before. Reverend Morrison was there with his wife, both ready to work. The blacksmith from town brought his portable forge to handle any metalwork needed. Women arrived with baskets of food, enough to feed an army. Children ran around underfoot, excited by the community gathering. Even some of Sawyer's ranch hands showed up, though they made it clear they were there on their own time, not representing their boss. One of them, a grizzled older man named Pete, pulled Thomas aside. Want you to know, Pete said quietly, most of us don't hold with what happened. That fire. It wasn't right, no matter what grudge Sawyer's nursing, so we're here to help make it right. Thomas nodded, too moved to speak for a moment. Finally, he managed, Thank you. Means a lot. You did a brave thing, running in to save those horses. Takes a good man to risk his life like that. Figure a good man deserves a good barn. As the morning progressed, the work took on a rhythm all its own. The men organized themselves into teams, some digging post holes for the foundation, others cutting lumber to Thomas's specifications, still more working on framing. The women set up a cook station and kept everyone fed and watered. The older children helped where they could, while the younger ones were corralled into games that kept them safely out of the way. Thomas moved through it all like a conductor leading an orchestra, directing traffic despite his bandaged hands. Eliza watched him with growing admiration. This shy, silent man who'd arrived barely able to speak to her was now coordinating dozens of people, using gestures and short phrases to communicate his vision. People listened to him, respected his knowledge. He'd found his voice not through eloquent speeches, but through competent action. By midday, the basic frame was up. The work had gone faster than anyone expected, with so many hands contributing. They broke for lunch, everyone gathering to eat and rest and admire the progress. Eliza found herself surrounded by women offering advice, sharing their own stories of hardship and survival, welcoming her into a community she'd kept herself separate from for too long. Your husband's quite capable, Mrs. Morrison observed, watching Thomas explain something to a group of younger men. Quiet sort, but steady. That counts for more than charm in the long run. I'm learning that, Eliza said. My Henry was the same way, another woman added. Barely spoke when we courted. But 40 years later, I can tell you there's peace in a quiet man. They think before they speak, which is more than you can say for most. The women laughed, warm and knowing, and Eliza felt herself relax into their acceptance. She'd been so defensive for so long, so determined to prove she could handle everything alone. But there was relief in letting down those walls, in admitting she needed help and receiving it without judgment. The afternoon brought unexpected drama when Frank Sawyer himself rode up. The good-natured noise of construction faltered as people noticed him, conversations dying mid-sentence. Sawyer surveyed the scene with his characteristic arrogance, taking in the partially constructed barn, the crowd of volunteers, the efficient organization of it all. Thomas was up on the frame, helping secure a crossbeam. When he saw Sawyer, his whole body tensed. Eliza crossed the yard quickly, positioning herself between her property and the intruder. Mr. Sawyer, she said coolly, I don't recall inviting you. Just came to see how you were faring after your unfortunate accident, Sawyer said, his tone making it clear he didn't consider it an accident at all. Impressive turnout, though I have to wonder how long this community charity will last once these good folks realize they're propping up a failing enterprise. We're not failing, Eliza said firmly. Not today, perhaps. But winter's coming. You've still got loans to pay, and I've heard the bank's extension won't last forever. Sawyer smiled, oily and confident. My offer still stands, Miss Monroe, or should I say, Mrs. Avery. 50 cents on the dollar for everything. Take it before you lose it all to foreclosure. The answer is still no. Your pride is going to cost you everything. Maybe. But at least I'll lose it on my terms, not yours. Sawyer's face darkened. You're making a mistake, both of you. This land should belong to someone who knows what they're doing with it, not some spinster in her mail-order mute. The slur hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Eliza felt rage surge through her, but before she could respond, Thomas was there. He'd climbed down from the frame with surprising speed and now stood beside her, his eyes locked on Sawyer's face. Leave, Thomas said. His voice was low but carried clearly in the sudden silence. Now. Or what? You'll stutter at me until I go away? Thomas took a step forward, and something in his posture made Sawyer's horse sidestep nervously. I pulled 8 horses out of a burning barn, while you watched, or worse. Another step. You want to insult me? Fine. Been insulted my whole life, doesn't hurt anymore. But you insult my wife? His hands clenched into fists despite the bandages. That I won't tolerate. The threat in his words was unmistakable. Sawyer seemed to realize he'd miscalculated. He was surrounded by people who had no love for him, facing a man who'd proven his courage in fire. His bravado faltered. This isn't over, Sawyer said, trying to regain control. You'll regret not taking my offer when you had the chance. Only thing I regret, Thomas said clearly, is wasting breath talking to you. Get off our property. Sawyer wheeled his horse and rode off, and the moment he was gone, the crowd erupted in approval. Men clapped Thomas on the back, praising his spine. Women nodded approvingly. Someone started a cheer that spread through the assembled volunteers. Thomas looked overwhelmed by the attention, color rising in his face, but he held his ground, accepting the congratulations with shy nods and quiet thanks. When the moment passed and people returned to work, he found Eliza watching him with open admiration. My wife, he said softly. Said, my wife. Felt good to say. It felt good to hear, Eliza replied. She reached up and kissed his cheek, not caring who saw. Thank you for defending me. Always, Thomas said simply. That's what husbands do. The work continued with renewed energy, everyone motivated by the confrontation with Sawyer. By the time the sun began lowering toward the mountains, the barn's frame was complete. The roof was partially shingled, and stall walls were going up inside. It was remarkable progress, more than Eliza had dared hope for. As darkness fell and people began packing up to leave, promising to return the following Saturday to finish the work, Eliza stood with Thomas surveying what they'd accomplished. The new barn rose against the sunset, skeletal but strong, a testament to community and determination. We did it, she said, still hardly believing it. They did it, Thomas corrected. We just provided the reason. We provided more than that. We provided hope, proof that good people will show up for each other. Thomas slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. It was a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks, this casual intimacy between them. Your father would be proud. Of you. Of this. Eliza felt tears threaten. I hope so. I hope he'd understand why I did what I did. Advertising for a husband, bringing in a stranger. Not a stranger anymore. No, not anymore. She turned in his arms to face him. You've become something much more important. You've become my partner, my friend, my... She hesitated over the word, then said it anyway. My love. Thomas's eyes widened. You mean that? I do. I know this started as an arrangement, a practical solution, but somewhere along the way it became real. You became real to me. And I realized I don't want this to be a business partnership anymore. I want it to be a real marriage, in every sense. Eliza, Thomas struggled with the words, emotion making them even harder than usual. I've loved you since before I even met you. Your letters, they were kind, honest, made me feel like maybe I could be enough for someone. And then I met you and you were better than I imagined. Stronger, braver, beautiful inside and out. I didn't think I deserved. He made a frustrated sound, unable to finish. You deserve everything, Eliza said, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. You deserve love and happiness and a home where you're appreciated for exactly who you are. And if you'll have me, I want to give you all of that. Thomas kissed her then, deep and thorough, pouring everything he couldn't say into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'll have you, he whispered, for as long as you'll have me. Forever. If you'll let me stay that long. Forever sounds perfect. They went inside as the last of the sunset faded from the sky, leaving the half-built barn standing watch over the property. The house felt different now, warmer somehow, more alive. It had stopped being just Eliza's father's house and had become their home, filled with their combined presence, their shared hopes. That night they made love for the first time, gentle and awkward and sweet, learning each other's bodies the way they'd been learning each other's hearts. Thomas was tentative, always asking permission with his eyes and hands before proceeding. Eliza guided him with patience and growing passion, discovering that his silence extended to this too. He expressed himself through touch and gesture, through the way he looked at her like she was something precious and miraculous. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Eliza's head on Thomas's chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She traced idle patterns on his skin, feeling utterly content for the first time in longer than she could remember. Tell me about Ohio, she said, about where you came from. You never talk about your past. Thomas tensed slightly. Not much to tell. Wasn't happy there. Why not? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then slowly he began to speak. My father was cruel, especially about the stutter. Thought I was weak, useless, beat me trying to beat it out of me. Made it worse, of course. My mother couldn't protect me. Or wouldn't. After she died, it got worse, so I left. Apprenticed as a farrier, kept my head down, kept quiet. Figured if I stayed invisible, I'd stay safe. Oh, Thomas. Eliza's heart ached for the boy he'd been, hurt and afraid and alone. Saw your advertisement in the paper. Felt like a sign. A chance to start over somewhere. Nobody knew me. Nobody had expectations I'd already failed to meet. And you said you didn't need pretty speeches, just honest work. I could do that. Could be that. You've been so much more than that. I tried. Wanted to be worthy of the chance you gave me. Of you. Eliza rose up on one elbow to look down at him in the moonlight. You were always worthy. Your father was wrong about you. You're not weak or useless. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. Running into that fire proved that. Wasn't thinking, just acted. That's what bravery is. Acting despite the fear. Thomas reached up to touch her face, his bandaged hand surprisingly gentle. You make me feel brave. Make me feel like I could be the man you see when you look at me. You already are that man. You just needed to believe it. They made love again, slower this time, with more confidence and less hesitation. And when they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both felt the deep satisfaction of having found something rare and precious. A partner who saw them clearly, flaws and all, and chose them anyway. The following week passed in a blur of activity. The barn raising continued the next Saturday with another strong turnout. By day's end, the structure was complete. Roof finished, stalls built, doors hung. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and functional, exactly what they needed. During the week, Thomas had continued working on the breeding lease arrangements, writing to neighboring ranches to finalize deals. His reputation had spread after the fire. The mail-order husband who'd saved all his horses had become something of a local legend. People respected that kind of courage and dedication. Ranchers who might have hesitated to do business with Eliza alone were happy to work with the couple together. By the time November arrived, they had enough commitments to cover the loan payment with a small cushion left over. It was tight, closer than Eliza liked, but they'd made it work. The day they rode to town to make the payment, Thomas insisted on accompanying her into the bank. He held her hand as they approached the teller, his presence a solid reassurance. When they counted out the money, every dollar hard-earned through their combined efforts, Eliza felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. They'd done it. Against all odds, despite the fire and Sawyer's interference and every setback, they'd saved the ranch. Outside the bank, Eliza threw her arms around Thomas and hugged him tightly. "We did it. We actually did it." "We did," Thomas agreed, his voice warm with satisfaction. "Together." "Together," Eliza echoed. They celebrated that night with a simple dinner at home, just the two of them. Over pot roast and potatoes, they talked about the future, about expanding the breeding operation, about possibly acquiring more land, about all the possibilities that stretched before them now that immediate crisis had been averted. "I want to build you a workshop," Eliza said, "a proper space for your forge and tools. You've been making do with what survived the fire, but you deserve better." "That's not necessary," Thomas protested. "It is, though. Your metalwork is beautiful, Thomas, and practical. You could take on projects from town, make extra income. I've seen how good you are," as Thomas looked pleased and embarrassed in equal measure. "Maybe could be useful. It would be more than useful. It would be yours. A space where you can create and work and not have to talk to anyone if you don't want to." He smiled at her understanding. "You know me well." "I'm learning. Every day I learn something new about you." "Same. You're more than I expected, in all the best ways." They cleaned up dinner together, moving around each other with the easy familiarity of a couple who'd found their rhythm. Then Thomas led Eliza outside into the crisp November night. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any competing light. The new barn stood solid and reassuring in the darkness. The horses moved peacefully in the pasture, safe and content. Everything felt right in a way it hadn't for over a year. "I have something for you," Thomas said. He pulled a small carved object from his pocket and held it out to her. Eliza took it carefully. It was a wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, carved with exquisite detail. Every line of muscle, every strand of mane was rendered perfectly. "Thomas, this is beautiful. When did you make this?" "At night, when you were sleeping. Wanted to give you something, to thank you." "For what?" "For everything, for taking a chance on me, for not giving up when I couldn't speak properly, for seeing past all my broken parts to who I could be." His voice was thick with emotion. "You saved me, Eliza, much as I saved those horses. Maybe more." "We saved each other," Eliza said, clutching the carved horse to her chest. "That's what partners do." Thomas pulled her close, and they stood together under the stars. Two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something stronger than either had been alone. The ranch spread around them, still fragile but surviving, held together by hard work and hope and love. "I'm glad you answered my advertisement," Eliza said softly. "Best decision I ever made, coming here, taking the chance. Best decision I ever made was letting you stay." They kissed under the vast Colorado sky, and Eliza thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the desperation that had led her to advertise for a husband, the courage it had taken Thomas to answer, the fire that had tested them, the community that had supported them. All of it had been necessary, every trial and triumph, to forge them into the partnership they'd become. She didn't know what challenges tomorrow would bring. Sawyer was still out there, still nursing his grudge. Winter was coming with all its harsh demands. The ranch would require constant attention and hard work to keep thriving, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came, they'd face it together. And that made all the difference in the world. Winter arrived in earnest the week after they made their loan payment, bringing with it snow that blanketed the valley in white silence. The new barn proved its worth immediately, keeping the horses warm and dry through the first blizzard. Thomas had designed it well. The ventilation prevented moisture buildup while still maintaining heat, and the thick walls blocked the worst of the wind. Eliza and Thomas settled into the rhythm of winter ranch life, their days structured around the needs of the animals and the land. They worked side by side through feeding and mucking stalls, through repairing equipment and planning for spring. The close quarters and long evenings brought them even closer together, conversations flowing more easily as Thomas grew increasingly comfortable in his own home. His stutter was still there, would probably always be there, but it mattered less now. Eliza had learned to wait patiently when words stuck, to read his gestures and expressions when speech failed him entirely. And Thomas, for his part, had stopped apologizing for it. He was learning to accept himself the way she accepted him, as whole and worthy, stutter and all. One evening in late November, they were sitting by the fire when someone pounded on the door. Thomas rose immediately, his hand going instinctively to the rifle above the mantel. Visitors after dark were unusual, and given Sawyer's hostility, potentially dangerous. "Who is it?" Eliza called. Pete Johnson, from Sawyer's place. Please, I need to speak with you." Thomas exchanged a glance with Eliza, then opened the door. Pete stood on the porch, hatless and breathing hard as if he'd ridden fast. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his expression was grim. "Come in," Eliza said. "What's wrong?" Pete stepped inside, his eyes darting between them. "I shouldn't be here. If Sawyer knew I'd come, I'd lose my job. But I couldn't stay quiet about this. It's not right." "About what?" Thomas asked. "Sawyer's planning something. I don't know exactly what, but I've heard things. He's been meeting with men from out of town, rough types, and he's been drinking heavy, talking about how you two humiliated him, how he's going to make sure you lose everything come spring." Eliza felt cold dread settle in her stomach. What kind of men? The kind you hire when you want something done and don't care how it gets done. Pete looked miserable. "I've worked for Sawyer for 10 years. He's always been ruthless in business, but this is different. This is personal now. And when things get personal with him, people get hurt." "Why are you telling us this?" Thomas asked quietly. "Because what you did, running into that burning barn, that took real courage. And the way everyone came together to help you rebuild, that showed what kind of people you are. Sawyer might sign my paychecks, but that doesn't mean I have to stand by while he destroys good folks." Pete shifted uncomfortably. "I can't give you specifics because I don't have them, but I wanted you to know to watch yourselves. Keep your eyes open. Don't make it easy for him." "Thank you," Eliza said, "for taking the risk to warn us." Pete nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. He's been asking questions around town about your loan terms, your breeding contracts, looking for any weakness he can exploit. Be careful who you trust with your business. Not everyone in town is immune to Sawyer's influence." After Pete left, Eliza and Thomas sat back down by the fire, but the cozy atmosphere had evaporated. They were silent for a long time, each lost in their own worried thoughts. "We could go to the sheriff," Eliza said finally. "Tell him what Pete said." "And say what? That we heard Sawyer might be planning something?" Thomas shook his head. "No proof. No specifics. Sheriff won't do anything. So we just wait for him to strike? We prepare. Make it hard for him to hurt us. And we watch." Thomas reached for her hand. "But we don't live in fear. We've worked too hard to let him steal our peace." Eliza squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his steady presence. "When did you get so wise?" "Not wise. Just stubborn. Refused to let my father break me. Won't let Sawyer break us either." They doubled their vigilance over the following weeks. Thomas installed better locks on the barn and house. They took turns checking the property at night, watching for any signs of intrusion or sabotage. The horses were brought into the barn before dark every evening rather than being left in the pasture. They varied their routines, never becoming too predictable. But as December wore on and nothing happened, Eliza began to wonder if Pete had been mistaken. Maybe Sawyer was all bluster and no action. Maybe the barn fire had been an aberration, a fit of rage he now regretted. She should have known better. The attack came on Christmas Eve. Eliza and Thomas had spent the day preparing a modest celebration. They'd invited Reverend Morrison and his wife for dinner, along with Pete and a few other neighbors who'd helped with the barn raising. It felt important to mark the holiday, to celebrate making it through the hardest year of Eliza's life and coming out stronger. The guests were due to arrive at 6. At 5:30, Thomas went out to the barn to do a final check on the horses. Eliza was in the kitchen putting finishing touches on the meal when she heard him shout. She ran outside without thinking, without grabbing a coat or weapon, driven by pure instinct. The barn door stood open, and inside she could hear the horses screaming in panic. Not again, she thought desperately. Please, not fire again. But it wasn't fire. It was worse. 3 men she'd never seen before were in the barn, trying to drive the horses out into the snow. Thomas was fighting them, outnumbered but not backing down. As Eliza watched in horror, one of the men swung a piece of lumber at Thomas's head. He ducked, but not quite fast enough. The blow caught him on the shoulder, sending him staggering. "Stop!" Eliza screamed, running toward them. The men turned, startled by her appearance. In that moment of distraction, Thomas recovered and lunged at the nearest one, tackling him to the ground. They grappled in the straw, Thomas fighting with desperate strength. The other 2 men started toward Eliza. She grabbed the first thing she could reach, a pitchfork, and brandished it like a weapon. "Get away from my husband! Get off my property!" "Lady, we're just doing a job," one of them said, his tone almost apologetic. "We got paid to scatter your stock, nothing personal." "Paid by Sawyer," Eliza spat. The man shrugged, neither confirming nor denying it. "Makes no difference who. Point is, you can let us do this easy, or you can make it hard, and someone gets hurt worse." "You're trespassing. That means I can shoot you, and the law will call it justified." Eliza's voice was steady, despite her terror. "And I promise you, I'm a very good shot." She was bluffing. The rifle was inside the house. But her confidence gave them pause. Behind them, Thomas had gotten the upper hand on his opponent, landing a solid punch that sent the man sprawling. He staggered to his feet, breathing hard, blood trickling from his split lip. 3 against 2, Thomas said, his voice rough but clear. "Not great odds for you. We've got friends coming. Be here any minute. How many witnesses do you want to your crime?" As if summoned by his words, they heard the sound of approaching wagons, the dinner guests arriving right on time. The 3 men heard it too and exchanged worried glances. They'd expected an easy job, scatter some horses, maybe rough up a couple of homesteaders. They hadn't signed on for witnesses and potential law enforcement. "This ain't over," one of them growled, but they were already backing toward their horses, which they'd tied outside. "Come back and it will be," Thomas said. "Next time I won't be gentle." The men mounted and rode off into the darkness just as Reverend Morrison's wagon pulled into the yard. The Reverend took one look at the scene, Eliza with her pitchfork, Thomas bleeding, the disturbed horses, and his face hardened. "What happened here?" Between them, Eliza and Thomas explained. Pete, who'd arrived right after the Reverend, went white with fury. "Sawyer, has to be. Those men you described, I've seen them at his place." "We need to go to the sheriff," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "This is attempted theft at minimum, possibly assault. The man needs to be stopped." "She's right," the Reverend agreed. "This has gone far enough. Sawyer may have money and influence, but he doesn't own this territory. The law needs to intervene." "Won't work," Thomas said, wincing as he probed his injured shoulder. "His word against ours. Those men won't testify against him. We have no proof." "You have Pete," Eliza said, turning to the ranch hand. "You've seen those men at Sawyer's place. You warned us he was planning something. You can testify to that." Pete looked torn, fear warring with righteousness on his weathered face. "If I testify against him, I'm done. Not just fired, blacklisted. No rancher in the territory will hire me after I turn on my boss." "We'll hire you," Eliza said immediately. "Full-time, fair wages. You'd have a place here for as long as you want it." "And the Reverend can attest to your character," Thomas added. "Others too. People who helped with the barn. You wouldn't be alone in this." Pete was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the decision. Finally, he nodded. All right, I'll do it. Sawyer's gone too far. Someone needs to stand up to him, and I guess it might as well be me." They loaded into wagons and rode into town together, a small procession in the Christmas Eve darkness. The sheriff was less than pleased to be pulled from his holiday dinner, but his attitude changed when he heard their story, particularly when Pete began naming names and providing details about Sawyer's hired men. "These are serious accusations," Sheriff Reeves said, leaning back in his chair. "Frank Sawyer is a prominent citizen. I can't just arrest him on hearsay." "It's not hearsay when you have a witness who works for him," Reverend Morrison said sharply. "And when there are visible injuries from an attack that happened less than an hour ago. I'll need to question these men Pete mentioned, verify his story. Those men are probably halfway back to wherever Sawyer hired them from," Eliza said. "He's not stupid enough to keep them around after a failed job." "Then I need more evidence, something concrete that ties Sawyer directly to tonight's incident." Thomas had been quiet, thinking. Now he spoke up. "The barn fire. Back in October. Pete, did you hear anything about that?" Pete hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "I didn't know for certain, but there was talk. A couple of the boys got drunk one night, started bragging about a job they'd done, setting a barn fire while folks were at a wedding. Sawyer shut them up real quick, but I heard enough." "Would those men still be working for Sawyer?" Sheriff Reeves asked, his interest clearly piqued now. "Billy Marks and Jim Crawford. Yeah, they're still there." "All right then." The sheriff stood. "I'll ride out to Sawyer's place tonight. Question these men separately, see if their stories match. If I can tie him to the barn fire with witness testimony, that's arson. That's prison time." "He'll deny everything," Eliza said. "He'll threaten his men into silence." "Maybe, but men facing prison time tend to talk to save their own skins. If I can get one of them to flip on Sawyer, offer him a deal, we might have something." It was thin hope, but it was hope nonetheless. They returned to the ranch and tried to salvage what was left of their Christmas Eve. The dinner was subdued. Everyone's nerves stretched tight with tension and uncertainty. But there was something powerful too in sitting around the table together, this small community of people who'd chosen to stand with each other against injustice. After the guests left, Eliza helped Thomas clean and bandage his split lip and examined his shoulder, which was already darkening with a spectacular bruise. "You could have been killed," she said quietly. 3 against 1. "Wasn't going to let them hurt the horses. Or you." Thomas caught her hand. "I know I'm not much of a fighter. Not strong like—" "Stop," Eliza interrupted. "You're the strongest man I know. Not because you can throw punches, but because you keep showing up, keep fighting even when you're scared. That's real strength." Thomas pulled her close, and they held each other in the quiet kitchen, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white. It should have been peaceful. Instead, it felt like waiting for something terrible to happen. Christmas Day brought unexpected news. Sheriff Reeves appeared at noon with an expression that was equal parts satisfied and grim. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, accepting the coffee Eliza offered. "I arrested Frank Sawyer this morning." Eliza felt her knees go weak with relief. "You got him to confess?" "Better. I got Jim Crawford to confess. Turns out he's been having second thoughts about his life choices, and the threat of arson charges was enough to loosen his tongue. He confirmed that Sawyer paid him and Billy Marks to burn your barn. Also admitted to being one of the men who tried to scatter your horses last night, though he claims he didn't know violence was part of the plan." "Will it stick?" Thomas asked. "Or will Sawyer's lawyers get him out?" "With Crawford's testimony and Pete's corroboration, I'd say we've got a solid case. Plus, once Crawford flipped, Billy Marks started talking too. Seems there's no honor among criminals after all." The sheriff's smile was grim. "Sawyer's looking at serious time, and even if his lawyers manage to reduce the charges, his reputation is destroyed. Nobody's going to do business with a man who burns barns and hires thugs to attack his neighbors." After the sheriff left, Eliza and Thomas stood together on the porch, watching snow fall over their ranch. The nightmare was over. Sawyer was facing justice, his threat neutralized. They were safe. "We did it," Eliza said softly. "We actually survived him." "We survived everything," Thomas corrected. "The barn fire, the loan payment, the attacks, all of it, because we stood together. I couldn't have done it alone." "Neither could I. That's the point. Together we're stronger than—" than anything trying to break us. Eliza turned to face him, this man who'd arrived terrified and uncertain and had transformed into someone who'd fight 3 men to protect what mattered. I love you, Thomas Avery. I don't think I've said that enough, but I do, completely. I love you too, always will. Until the day He smiled, recognizing his tendency to quote vows. Until the day I die. They kissed in the falling snow, and Eliza felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of having found exactly where she belonged. This ranch, this life, this man, all of it had been worth fighting for. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace Eliza had almost forgotten was possible. With Sawyer awaiting trial and his hired men having scattered, the valley felt safer. The breeding contracts continued to come in, and Thomas's reputation as a skilled farrier began to spread. Ranchers started bringing him work, which he handled with quiet competence from the workshop Eliza had built for him near the new barn. She loved watching him work, loved seeing him in his element with metal and fire and tools. He was beautiful in those moments, completely focused and sure of himself, all his self-consciousness burned away by the heat of creation. He made horseshoes and hinges, repaired broken equipment, even crafted decorative pieces that people admired and ordered for their own homes. And slowly, very slowly, his speech began to improve. Not because the stutter disappeared, it didn't, probably never would, but because he stopped fighting it so hard. He learned to breathe through the difficult words, to accept that sometimes speech would take him longer, and that was all right. The people who mattered, the people worth talking to, would wait. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought renewal and hope. The breeding season was successful, with several foals born healthy and strong. The ranch was turning a profit for the first time since Eliza's father's death. They hired Pete full-time as promised, and he proved invaluable, his experience and dedication helping them expand their operation. In April, on a day when the valley was painted with wildflowers and the mountains still wore caps of snow, Eliza realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks but had been afraid to hope, afraid to jinx it by speaking it aloud. Now, standing in the kitchen watching Thomas work in his forge through the window, she knew with certainty. She was carrying their child, a baby conceived in love and hope, a symbol of the future they were building together. Thomas looked up from his work as if sensing her gaze. Their eyes met across the distance, and she smiled, touching her stomach in a gesture that conveyed everything. She saw the moment understanding hit him, saw his face transform with joy so pure and complete it made her eyes sting with tears. He dropped his tools and ran toward the house, bursting through the door and sweeping her into his arms despite his soot-covered clothes. "A baby?" he managed. "Really? Really?" Eliza confirmed, laughing through happy tears. "We're going to be parents." Thomas kissed her deeply, then dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach, as if he could hear their child's heartbeat through flesh and bone. "Hello in there," he whispered. This is your father, and I promise I'll be better than mine was. I'll love you no matter what, no matter how you talk or what you struggle with. You'll always be enough, always be wanted." Eliza ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed with love for this gentle, broken, beautiful man who was determined to break the cycle of his own childhood. "You're going to be an amazing father." "I hope so. Hope I can give this child everything I never had. Safety, love, a home where they never have to be afraid." "We'll give them that together," Eliza said. "That's what we do best. Together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. Eliza continued to work the ranch as long as she could, with Thomas becoming increasingly protective and Pete taking on more of the heavy labor. The community rallied around them again, women stopping by with advice and hand-me-down baby clothes, men offering help with the fall harvest. Sawyer's trial happened in July. Crawford's testimony, combined with Pete's and the evidence of pattern behavior, resulted in a guilty verdict. Sawyer was sentenced to 5 years in prison for arson and conspiracy to commit theft. His ranch was sold to cover legal fees and restitution, the land divided among several buyers. His empire, built on intimidation and ruthlessness, crumbled in a matter of months. Eliza felt no triumph in his downfall, only relief that the threat was permanently neutralized. Justice had been served, and they could move forward without looking over their shoulders. In late October, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding, Eliza went into labor. Thomas was beside himself with worry, pacing the house, while Mrs. Morrison and the midwife attended to Eliza upstairs. Pete had to physically restrain him from barging into the room every time Eliza cried out. "First babies take time," Pete said calmly. "All you can do is wait and trust the women know what they're doing." "But she's in pain. I can hear. I should be with her." "You'll just be in the way. When the time comes, they'll call you." The labor lasted 12 hours, which the midwife assured Thomas was perfectly normal, but which felt like an eternity to him. When he was finally allowed upstairs, he found Eliza exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Thomas," she said softly, smiling through her tiredness, "come meet your daughter." A daughter. Thomas approached slowly, reverently, as if the baby might disappear if he moved too quickly. Eliza pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny face, eyes squeezed shut, miniature fists waving in the air. "She's perfect," Thomas breathed. "She is. Do you want to hold her?" Thomas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Eliza placed the baby in his arms. She was so small, so fragile, this tiny life they'd created together. Thomas looked down at his daughter and felt his heart crack open with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa, and I've been waiting to meet you." The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but searching, and Thomas felt tears stream down his face. "Thank you," he said to Eliza. "For this, for her, for everything. Thank you for being the man I can build this life with. I couldn't imagine doing it with anyone else." They named her Sarah, after Eliza's mother. Sarah Avery, with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair, perfect in every way. The house that had felt empty and sad for so long now rang with new life, with baby cries and laughter, with the sounds of a family being built from love and determination. As winter settled in again and the family found their rhythm, feeding schedules and diaper changes and sleepless nights, Eliza often found herself marveling at how much had changed in a single year, how she'd gone from desperate and alone to surrounded by love, how Thomas had gone from the frightened stranger at the train station to this confident father singing lullabies to their daughter in his rough but tender voice. One evening, with Sarah sleeping peacefully in her cradle and snow falling softly outside, Thomas and Eliza sat together by the fire. He was working on another carving, a bird this time, wings spread in flight, while she mended a shirt. The domestic contentment of the moment was almost overwhelming. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Eliza asked. "When we first met?" "All the time. Think about how terrified I was, how certain I was that you'd take one look and send me back." "I almost did," Eliza admitted. "That first week I wasn't sure we could make it work. You were so quiet, so withdrawn. I thought maybe I'd made a terrible mistake." "What changed your mind?" "You did. The way you worked so hard to prove yourself. The way you talked to the horses like they were friends. The journal you gave me so I could understand what you couldn't say. All those little things added up until I realized you weren't withdrawn. You were just cautious, and for good reason." Thomas set down his carving and took her hand. "You saved my life, Eliza. Not dramatically, but by giving me a place where I could be myself, where my silence wasn't seen as a flaw, where I was judged by my actions instead of my words. You saved mine too. I was drowning before you came, trying to do everything alone and failing. You showed me it was okay to need help, okay to build something with someone instead of fighting every battle solo." "Good partnership," Thomas said simply. "The best partnership." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance and listening to their daughter's soft breathing. Outside, the Colorado winter raged, but inside they were warm and safe and together. Sarah grew quickly, as babies do, transforming from a tiny bundle into a squirming, babbling infant who clearly had her own opinions about the world. She had her mother's determination and her father's observant nature, watching everything with intense focus. Thomas was a devoted father, carrying Sarah everywhere in a sling he'd crafted himself, talking to her constantly despite his stutter. Or maybe because of it. He wanted her to know from the earliest age that communication came in many forms, that struggling with words didn't make someone less worthy of being heard. "You're doing so well with her," Eliza said one morning, watching Thomas feed Sarah mashed vegetables while making funny faces to keep her entertained. "She doesn't judge. Doesn't care if I stutter or take too long to finish a sentence. She just listens, like you do. That's because she's brilliant and knows what matters." Sarah chose that moment to spit out her food, spraying both parents with orange mush. They looked at each other and burst into laughter, the kind of pure, joyful laughter that only comes from being completely at ease with your life. As spring returned again, marking the approach of their second anniversary, Eliza stood on the porch watching her husband play with their daughter in the yard. Thomas was teaching Sarah about the horses, letting her pat their soft noses under his careful supervision. She shrieked with delight every time Copper nickered at her, and Thomas's face was alight with happiness. Pete wandered over from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Never seen a man take to fatherhood like he has," he observed. "Some men, you can tell they're doing it because they're supposed to. But Thomas? He genuinely loves every minute of it." "He does," Eliza agreed. "I think he's determined to give Sarah everything he didn't have growing up. All the love and acceptance and encouragement. Well, she's a lucky little girl to have parents like you two. You've built something special here. Not just the ranch, though that's doing well enough, but the family, the life. That's the real success." Eliza smiled, recognizing the truth in his words. The ranch was thriving. They'd expanded to 50 horses now, with a waiting list for breeding services. Thomas's metalwork business brought in steady additional income. They'd even begun buying back some of the land Sawyer had owned, slowly building their holdings. But Pete was right. The real measure of their success wasn't in land or money or horses. It was in the love they'd built, in the family they'd created, in the home they'd made where both of them felt safe and valued and whole. That evening, after Sarah was asleep and the house was quiet, Thomas presented Eliza with another carving. This one was different from the others, more complex, more ambitious. It was a scene carved in relief on a flat piece of wood. A woman standing before a barn, a man beside her, and between them, held in their joined hands, a baby. In the background were mountains and horses, and overhead a sky full of stars. "It's us," Eliza breathed. "Our family. Thomas, this is beautiful." Wanted to capture this moment, this feeling of having everything I ever wanted, everything I never thought I'd have. His voice was thick with emotion. "Happy anniversary, Eliza." "Happy anniversary." She set the carving down carefully and moved into his arms. 2 years. It feels like a lifetime and like yesterday all at once. Best 2 years of my life. By far. They made love slowly, tenderly, reaffirming the bond between them. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Eliza thought about how far they'd both come. She'd been so certain she needed to be strong alone, to prove she could manage without help. But strength, she'd learned, wasn't about doing everything yourself. It was about knowing when to ask for help, when to lean on others, when to build something together that was stronger than the sum of its parts. And Thomas, who'd spent his life believing his voice didn't matter, had discovered that there were many ways to be heard. Through his actions, his artistry, his unwavering dedication to the people and things he loved. He'd found his voice not by overcoming his stutter, but by accepting it as just one part of who he was. Together they'd survived fire and sabotage, financial crisis, and outright attacks. They'd built a home and a family and a future. And they'd done it not despite their flaws and struggles, but incorporating them, accepting them, turning them into sources of strength rather than shame. Years passed, as they do, bringing new challenges and new joys. They had 2 more children, a son named John and another daughter named Margaret. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most respected breeding operations in the territory. Thomas's workshop became a destination for people from across Colorado seeking his fine metalwork. Sarah grew into a bright, talkative child who inherited her father's skill with horses and her mother's business sense. She never seemed to notice or care about her father's stutter, accepting it as just part of who he was. When she was 7, a boy at school made fun of the way Thomas talked. Sarah punched him in the nose and told him her papa was the bravest man in the whole world. Thomas had to pretend to be stern when lecturing her about violence not being the answer, but Eliza saw the pride shining in his eyes. Their daughter was fierce and loyal, willing to fight for the people she loved. She'd learned that from both of them. On their 10th anniversary, they took a rare day away from the ranch, riding up into the mountains with just each other for company. Pete and his wife, he'd married one of the women from town 2 years back, watched the children and managed the ranch for the day. They reached a meadow high above the valley and stopped to rest the horses. From here they could see their ranch spread out below, the buildings small but sturdy, the horses grazing peacefully in the pastures. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Eliza knew the children would be helping with dinner preparation, learning the rhythms of ranch life just as she once had. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked, following her gaze. "Advertising for a husband? Taking a chance on a stranger?" "Never, not once." "Do you regret answering?" "Best decision I ever made." Thomas pulled her close, his arm around her waist. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. That I get to wake up every day next to you, that we built all this together." "We did build it together. That's what makes it special. Anyone can inherit success, but we created ours from nothing but hope and hard work." "And love," Thomas added. "Don't forget love." "And love," Eliza agreed, smiling. They sat together on the mountainside, watching clouds drift across the vast sky, and Eliza thought about the journey that had brought them here. The desperate advertisement placed in a moment of crisis, the frightened man who'd answered, too scared to meet her eyes, the fire that had tested them and the community that had supported them, the love that had grown slowly, carefully, into something unshakable. She thought about that first meeting at the train station when she'd looked at Thomas and seen only problems and complications, when she'd been so focused on what he couldn't do that she'd nearly missed everything he could do. When she'd been so desperate for a solution that she'd almost failed to recognize the gift standing right in front of her. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. "I'm thinking about your eyes," Eliza said. "Sees how I noticed them that first day. How they said everything you couldn't speak out loud. How I almost missed the truth in them because I was too busy worrying about the words you weren't saying." Thomas turned to face her fully. "And what truth was that?" "That you were scared and brave at the same time. That you'd traveled across the country on nothing but hope. That you were someone worth knowing if I just gave you the chance." She reached up to touch his face, this beloved face that had become more dear to her than her own. "That you were exactly what I needed, even though you came in unexpected packaging. I saw things in your eyes too, that first day." Thomas spoke slowly, carefully, making sure each word was clear. "Saw strength and loneliness and determination. Saw someone who needed help but was too proud to ask for it. Saw someone who could understand what it meant to feel broken and keep going anyway." "Were we broken?" Eliza asked. "Or just bent?" "Bent," Thomas decided. "Bent, but not broken. And now we're stronger for it, because we bent together instead of separately." They rode back down the mountain as the sun lowered toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. As they approached the ranch, they could see their children playing in the yard, Pete checking on the horses, smoke rising from the chimney of the home they'd built together. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined when they were young. It was better. It was real and complicated and challenging and filled with more love than either had thought possible. That night, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Eliza found Thomas in his workshop. He was putting finishing touches on a rocking horse he'd been building for their youngest daughter's birthday, his hands moving with the practiced skill of years. She watched him work for a moment, this man who'd become her everything. His hair was starting to gray at the temples now, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into forge fires and smiling at his children. He was still shy sometimes, still struggled with words in stressful situations, but he was also confident in ways the frightened stranger from the train station had never been. Confident in his skills, in his worth, in the love surrounding him. He looked up and caught her watching, a smile spreading across his face. "Come here," he said, setting down his tools and holding out his hand. Eliza went to him, letting him pull her close. They swayed together in the quiet workshop, dancing to music only they could hear, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the scent of wood and metal. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing past the broken parts. For giving me a chance when I couldn't even speak my own name without stuttering. For building this life with me." "You weren't broken," Eliza said firmly. "You were just waiting for the right place to bloom, for someone to see you clearly. And you did, from the very beginning, even when I couldn't see myself." They held each other in the lamplight, two people who'd started as strangers bound by a contract and had become partners in the truest sense, who'd built a family and a legacy and a love that would outlast them both. And as the Colorado stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood watch over the valley, Thomas Avery, the mail-order husband who'd been too shy to speak, held his wife close and knew without words that he'd found exactly where he belonged. His eyes, those expressive eyes that had told Eliza everything she needed to know from that first meeting, now spoke of contentment and joy and a love too big for any language. And she understood him perfectly, just as she always had, just as she always would. Because some truths don't need words. Some stories are written in glances and gestures and the quiet dedication of showing up every day. Some love is too profound for speech, too deep for anything but the steady communion of two hearts beating in time. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. That was everything.